Chapter 173. Madman Li, who was known to be invincible in the military, was secretly admitted to the Army General Hospital that night. Of course, he was using a nickname. This 16-year-old military officer had never suffered any setbacks in his life. Whether it was because of his youthful vigor or his arrogance, he was not willing to let this embarrassing news spread throughout the world. The fight between the two people in Linyuan was actually extremely dangerous. In that kind of situation, whoever held back would only end up dead. In the end, both of them survived. Nothing serious happened. It was purely a matter of luck. Su Lu and Madman Li's 3 hits in one burst was extremely violent. In the last moment, because of a strange feeling of harmony, their limbs collided and the two people were knocked away. Both Su Lu and Madman Li knew that if the situation at that time had been changed to any other situation, one of them would have probably left on the spot to deal with the aftermath. Because of the commotion in the Lin Garden, the news of Deputy Minister Zhou's daughter being pregnant before marriage spread like wildfire. It was as if the news had wings attached to it, and it instantly spread throughout the upper class of Beijing. While people were shocked, they also couldn't help but have a bit of rumination. They wondered how Deputy Minister Zhou was going to deal with this matter, and whether or not the always low-key and mysterious Tai family would tolerate this kind of humiliation. Most people had forgotten about the existence of the young civilian second lieutenant. In the eyes of the upper echelons of society, this second lieutenant was only the trigger point of the incident. There wasn't much that was worth paying attention to. There were many people who didn't have foresight, but not everyone didn't notice the conflict between Madman Li and the civilian second lieutenant. The boss behind Linyuan, Lin Banshan, was naturally someone who knew how to judge goods. While he was out of town after seeing the surveillance video of that day through the internet, he just smiled and said, "I didn't expect Madman Li to be at a disadvantage in a fight. That's really surprising." What kind of person was Lin Banshan? He was the most famous wastrel among the 7 major families in the Federation. His pair of eyes that specialized in examining aesthetics in the starry sky had long been recognized by everyone. This comment spread back to the capital a few days later, and it couldn't help but cause many people to look back at Linyuan that night. People began to pay attention to the civilian first lieutenant. Although a few forces knew his name through investigation, this first lieutenant was still a nameless person. However, it was possible that he could become the future son-in-law of Deputy Minister Zhou, steal the future concubine of the Tai family's son, and fight to a draw with the crazy Lees of Philadelphia. No matter how nameless he would eventually become famous. The upper echelons of society in the Federation consisted of the 7 major families, politicians, and professional soldiers. They looked at the law with contempt, avoided the Constitution, and controlled the majority of human society's resources and information. This circle was the ruler of society. For tens of thousands of years after the beginning of the constitutional era, the entire Federation society was under this kind of control. This situation had been stable for tens of thousands of years. The civilian second lieutenant named Su Lu was like a small stone that suddenly broke into a bagel. It was a bit abrupt and a bit conspicuous. However, at this time, Su Lu was still only a topic that the upper echelons of society would occasionally talk about after a meal. Over the countless years, who knew how many outstanding talents had appeared among the citizens of the Federation? These outstanding figures who had climbed up from the bottom of society would in the end throw themselves into the circle they belonged to, be accepted, and then assimilated, becoming a part of this circle. In the eyes of the upper echelons of society that controlled the Federation, if Su Lu could really marry Zhou Yu, then he would naturally also enter this circle in the future. Even so, this was only one of countless examples. Naturally, they didn't need to pay too much attention to it. They didn't know the true relationship between Su Lu and Zhou Yu at all. Those truly important figures wouldn't care about what happened in Linyuan. At the very least, the powers in the Federation's upper echelons who supported Jingzhou Governor Ross and Senator Macklin didn't pay attention to him, even though Su Li's name had already begun to appear in a lot of information. If one day, Su Lu displayed abilities that were worth paying attention to, based on his relationship with the Tai family and the Zhou family, perhaps the huge power that was lurking in the shadows would begin to suppress him. However, to those important figures, the scene in Linyuan was just a boring competition between young people who had eaten too much. No matter how amazing Su Li's combat power was, it wouldn't change their calm emotions at all. After all, he wasn't Madman Li. Behind the crazy power there was a family and a god behind him, fetching by the side of the calm lake in front of the snow mountain. A middle-aged man wearing glasses and a black retro double-breasted suit was chatting with an old man. Some inauspicious light brown spots had begun to grow on the old man's face. Every time he saw these spots, the middle-aged man's mood would become a little lower. No matter how strong a human was, no, it should be said that he was the strongest human in the Federation, in the face of time he would still appear so weak. He was a major general in the Federation. However, when he was at home he never wore a military uniform. This was because this was his father's rule. Ever since the end of the war with the Empire more than 10 years ago, his father had personally sealed up the marshal's uniform. After that, he never wore a military uniform again. Instead, he always wore a rather ancient long gown. How were Wuxia's results? The highest rank in the Federation's military was a general. Other than during wartime, the president would wear the title of marshal in the name of the commander-in-chief of the three armed forces. Since the 37th constitutional calendar, the only exception was this old man. During the first war between the Federation and the Empire, this old man, with the fanatical support of hundreds of millions of Federation citizens, relied on his amazing achievements and was conferred the title of Marshal by the Management Committee of the Federation. The president's term of office was once every 5 years. He could only be re-elected once. However, this old man's position in the hearts of the Federation's citizens would never diminish. In a certain sense, this old man wearing a long gown was the true number one person in the Federation. However, this military god of the Federation at this moment spoke with the tone of an ordinary old man. He was extremely similar to an ancestor who longed for familial love. Wuxia's results after entering Academy 1's command department are already very good. During this half-year, he didn't fall behind in his studies either. Major General Li replied with a smile. I'm only worried that the child is too famous. His life in the academy will be a bit troublesome, the old man said with a smile. Major General Li also smiled. That unknown niece of his was probably one of the few people in the entire Federation whose fame could be mentioned in the same breath as his father. He suddenly thought of something. In a low voice he said, Li Feng is still kneeling in front of the manor's entrance. When will you let him in? That's your precious son. I can only control my son but not him. The old man closed his eyes. Through the empty wall of the courtyard, he felt the slightly cold wind blowing from the surface of the lake. He calmly said, as a soldier, he didn't listen to the orders of his superiors. Even if it is later proven that his choice at that time was correct, this kind of attitude still cannot be forgiven. Major General Li was silent. He knew that his father was blaming him for being too arrogant in disciplining his son. However, Li Feng had been thrown into the army by his father when he was 12 years old. For the past 4 years he had lived such a crazy life. As a father, he felt boundless guilt toward his own son. Naturally, he couldn't bear to be too strict. What do you mean by invincible in the army? There are many hidden dragons and crouching tigers in the Federation. Who knows how many masters in the body cultivation hall? This time he was beaten so badly that he couldn't speak. Only then did he know that the military pot was made of iron. The old man slowly opened his eyes. This is also a lesson for him. Otherwise, if he continues to be so arrogant, he won't have a good time at the front line of the West Woods. Major General Li was silent. He was very clear about his son's terrifying strength. In the federal military, there were few people who could be his opponent. However, since his father said so, he certainly didn't dare to refute. It was only when he heard the words, front line of the West Wood, that his expression became a little more serious. Whether it was Commander Zhong or that fatty Tian, when they saw Madman Li, they would probably have the urge to go up and beat him up. Sulu didn't know who would be alarmed by his fight with Madman Li in the Linyuan restaurant, but this didn't affect his clear-headed judgment. Perhaps without him knowing, he had already entered a certain circle. His identity as a fugitive from the Federation didn't worry him much. It had been almost 2 years, and neither the Tai family nor the Shell Motor Company had found out his true identity. It seemed that after the central computer of the Bureau of Proclamation confirmed it, there were no forces or geniuses that connected him, a second lieutenant, to an unknown orphan in the East Woods area. The only thing that worried him was that he wasn't sure if Madman Li had detected the power he used. Madman Li was able to obtain the title of Invincible in the army, and the strength he displayed in the Linyuan restaurant was indeed exceptionally terrifying. Under these circumstances, he, who wasn't at a disadvantage, should have attracted some people's attention. The Lees of Philadelphia. Could his secret be hidden from the eyes of the Federation's god of war? Besides, Sulu always had a vague feeling that Uncle Feng, you might have an unclear relationship with the Lees of Philadelphia. Because of this vigilance, after returning from the Linyuan restaurant that night, Sulu started to get busy. From the utility room in the apartment, he took out a lot of standard wires and some common equipment that he ordered online, and started to assemble and decorate as fast as he could. Sitting on the sofa, Zoyu thoughtfully looked at Sulu, who was busy. She didn't know what this guy was busy with outside the apartment building. The weather in the late spring was finally hot, and Sulu couldn't stay at home to be exposed to the cold air. Sweating profusely, he simply took off his coat. Zoyu looked at his well-proportioned body and exposed muscles, and her beautiful nose twitched slightly. It's just well-proportioned, that's all. How can this body contain so much strength? He can actually fight to a draw with Madman Li? Zoyu was puzzled. At the entrance of the Linhai nightclub, she already knew that Sulu was very good at fighting and could fight to a draw with Hook, a former Special Forces soldier. But what kind of person was Madman Li? The only heir of the Lees of Philadelphia, the crazy young military officer who had never met a worthy opponent. What are you busy with? At this time, Sulu broke open the wires in the walls of the apartment. With a serious expression, he broke open the tricolored wires and began to connect to the data wires and equipment in the apartment. Zoyu finally couldn't hold back her curiosity and asked. Sulu didn't answer her for the time being. Only when all the data wires were gathered into a device by his bed and the final data was corrected did he relax slightly and explain. I installed some surveillance equipment around the perimeter of the apartment. Zoyu's eyebrows furrowed. She didn't understand the meaning of Suli's words. Could it be that this guy was worried that his father or brother would mobilize the military to arrest him? Not to mention that in the complicated political environment in the capital, would his father or brother be stupid enough to use military force to resolve family matters? Even if this really happened, could it be that Sulu wanted to rely on these abnormally crude surveillance equipment to discover the whereabouts of the military in advance? She couldn't help but laugh slightly. At this time, Suli's back was facing her, so he naturally didn't see her expression. He seriously pulled out an extremely thin holographic screen from the device and looked at the different colored dots on the holographic screen. He lightly sighed. This was the equipment that Shi Qinghai gave him before he left. When he was escaping from the Federation Investigation Bureau's pursuit in Linhai State, this set of surveillance equipment played a very important role. The range of the surveillance was about 500 meters around the apartment building. The main principle was to obtain the power of the Federal Military or Investigation Bureau's communication device, and then distinguish it. Sulu used the materials he ordered online to supplement the periphery of this set of equipment. It should be able to barely achieve the effect that Shi Qinghai used it before. He turned his head and looked at Zoyu. He suddenly became silent for a moment because he wasn't worried about the Zhou family, but the Lees of Philadelphia and the entire Federation. The original purpose of living with Zoyu was to ensure the safety of her and the child in her belly. However, because of the Linyuan incident, Sulu fell into a state of vigilance. He realized that Zoyu wasn't very safe with him. These 2 days there hasn't been any reaction from your family. After a moment of silence, Sulu said, it seems that your brother is very frightened by your actions. According to the Federation's law, the fetus after 6 months has the corresponding human rights. I think after a while your family will be forced to accept this fact. When that time comes you should go home, right? Zoyu's eyes lit up, but it was the kind of cold light that reflected the light of the 2 moons like ice. She quietly stared at Suli's face, and a cold smile gradually appeared on her face. She opened her mouth and said, what? It hasn't even been a month and you can't take it anymore? Sulu knew that she misunderstood something. He lowered his head and explained, it's my problem. I'm worried that you won't be safe with me. Shi Qinghai was the only person in the world who could see at first glance that Sulu was hiding a heavy secret under his sunny face. It was very obvious that the mother of his unborn child didn't have this ability. But seeing Su Li's abnormal behavior today, as well as these words, and then thinking about the tenacity and calmness that Sulu had displayed these past few days, so you finally discovered a trace of a problem. You have a secret. And it has to do with Madman Li, so you gently supported her bulging belly and slowly stood up. She calmly looked at him and said, "You're ready to run away at any time." Sulu was silent, not knowing how to answer her. No wonder even Madman Li couldn't smash you to death. Seems that I still underestimated you. I always thought that in the future you would shine brightly in the Federation, but I didn't expect that you've been hiding your strength all this time. Everyone has their own secrets. I just realized that being with me won't make you safer. Sulu sincerely advised. Zhou quietly looked at him. After a long time, she suddenly opened her mouth and said, "It's very late. I'm going to sleep." After saying this, Zhou took off the towel wrapped around her head, threw it on the sofa, and walked to her bedroom without looking back. It wasn't until she closed the bedroom door and sat on the bed that Zhou felt a trace of disbelief about her previous performance. She looked at herself in the mirror without makeup and slightly frowned. She was becoming more and more accustomed to her face without makeup. Although when she had afternoon tea with Lady Tai, she only wore light makeup. But how many years had it been since her face was so clean? Just as Sulu said, with the heroic spirit Zhou had displayed in the tea house that day, whether it was Zhou or that big shot from the Ministry of Defense, there was nothing they could do. They could only watch as Zhou gave birth to the child. However, Zhou didn't want to leave this simple apartment. She quietly looked at herself in the mirror, becoming more and more beautiful. She thought to herself that staying in this apartment to block trouble for Sulu was not something she would do in the past. When did she become a good girl who was willing to be considerate of irrelevant people? Was it because of the child in her arms, or was it because that guy washed her hair? Perhaps she was just used to this kind of peaceful environment, where she didn't have to worry about anything. Outside the bedroom door, Sulu stared blankly at the closed door. Although Zhou didn't say anything, from her previous words and actions, she definitely wouldn't leave. He very sensitively guessed the thoughts of this unmarried mother. Zhou didn't know what his trouble was, but she knew that as the daughter of the Deputy Minister of Defense and a girl who had a good relationship with Lady Tai, any trouble in the Federation would always be more powerless when she was with Sulu. He walked into the bathroom and happily took a cold shower. Wearing a bath towel, he walked in front of the mirror and began to carefully shave. He began to more carefully shave the fine hairs between his eyebrows. He gently stroked the cold metal bracelet on his wrist and confirmed the location of the new stun baton. He raised his head and looked at his knife-like eyebrows in the mirror. He was silent for a long time. So you had changed. In the mirror, Sulu smiled happily, giving birth to a trace of warmth and happiness. The next few days were the complete opposite of Su Li's vigilance. It was as calm and peaceful as usual. It was as if the battle with Madman Li and Lin Yuan didn't have any negative effects at all. Every morning, Sulu made breakfast and wrote a note to remind Zhou where the microwave food in the freezer was stored. Then, he drove the unmarked black car through Highway 2, past Hawking Avenue and the Ministry of Finance, and drove towards the first military academy. Professor Shen was still in the hospital. He didn't know what illness he had. With this old professor's age, it was probably a sad time for him to be plagued with hundreds of illnesses. Sometimes, Sulu thought that as Professor Shen's only research assistant, he should go to the hospital to visit. However, he didn't have Professor Shen's contact information, and the officials at the Research Institute didn't reply to his emails. After finishing a day of work at the Research Institute, Sulu drove the black car back to his simple apartment in Wangdu. He started to cook dinner, prepare the ingredients for tomorrow's lunch, do the housework, and search for the things and information he needed on the civilian internet. Sometimes he even washed Zhou's hair. Her smooth, black hair twirled between his steady, slender fingers now. He and Zhou would occasionally chat, and the atmosphere between the two of them was getting better and better. However, after Zhou asked Shi Qinghai for the nth time about interesting childhood stories, Sulu suddenly realized that he couldn't find anything new to talk about. Or rather, between the two of them, they didn't need to talk too much in the first place. Life passed by just like that, day after day. It seemed normal and boring, but in reality it was peaceful and quiet. In this peaceful life, the only thing that made Sulu feel excited was that now, in the laboratory that was exclusively for him, he could finally fully display his mechanical talents. His research on the signal acquisition system for the simulator had reached a critical juncture. With the help of the all-encompassing blueprints in his mind, Sulu was sure that as long as he was given enough time to experiment, he would definitely be able to complete the modification of the simulation system and use the power in his body to directly operate mecha. If he could really succeed, it would undoubtedly be a revolutionary breakthrough in mecha control. Unfortunately, this method could only be used by Sulu alone, or perhaps by Uncle Fengyu, or perhaps by the Lees of Philadelphia. Sulu was able to accomplish this because, other than relying on Professor Shun's laboratory's enormous database and its rich material inventory, more importantly, he had built an extremely solid foundation of practical experience under the subtle influence and guidance of Uncle Fengyu over the years. More importantly, of course, were those strange blueprints in his mind. Those structures and designs that were vaguely beyond the current level of the Federation's technology were not necessarily perfect. In fact, many of them were completely unfeasible. However, those strange and even absurd design concepts and structures had given Sulu great inspiration. Without the inspiration and help of these blueprints, he definitely would not have been able to complete the full modification of the signal acquisition system for the simulation system by himself. It should be known that any research in the Federation's field of study had to be built on the basis of a large number of experiments and design simulations. No expert had ever been able to completely modify a system by himself. In a situation where no one knew, in a laboratory in the Husk Institute's 3rd Division, there was a young civilian second lieutenant who had produced results that were destined to shock many people. However, Sulu needed the opportunity to experiment. That would require him to interact with a mecha alone for a long period of time. And this was relatively difficult. The Federation mecha was an absolute secret. With Sulu's current level of secrecy, although he could access the information, he could not reasonably request to come into contact with the actual mecha. In order to convert his virtual designs on the holographic screen desktop into reality, Sulu needed to be able to solve the several difficult problems in the engineering department. Only then would he be able to enter the core area of the engineering department and experiment with his own things. However, the problem of the twin engines was not something the current Sulu could solve. He stared blankly at the blueprints on the holographic screen desktop, his brows furrowed tightly. The complex power system was completely different from the simulation system. Not to mention coming up with an effective solution, just the terrifying amount of calculations and capturing the trajectory of the electron jets were already abnormally difficult. Chapter 174. The newest generation of mecha developed by Shell Motor Company had yet to be named. Internally, it was temporarily known as the MX. This generation of mecha had been developed for over 10 years. Compared to the previous series of M52 mecha, the MX mecha had a decisive breakthrough in terms of power. The MX mecha still used Jingnong's high-energy batteries as its power source. However, 2 of the newest jet engines were installed at the back of the mecha's waist. These engines could instantly increase the mecha's power output to 4 times that of the M52 mecha. This design was undoubtedly a bold and genius idea. After 10 years of research, after overcoming a series of material and microelectronics difficulties, the multi-engine technology of a warship had finally been successfully transplanted into a mecha. The realization of this idea not only made the engineers of the entire Shell Motor Company rejoice, the federal military also felt an unprecedented excitement. 2 times the normal power in a steady state, 4 times the normal power in an instant, this was an indicator of leapfrogging development. If placed on the battlefield, the MX mecha with 4 times the normal power could completely rely on its powerful mobility to treat the old mecha like a clumsy child. What made the military most excited was that if the multi-engine technology matured in the future and the mobility of the military mecha increased once more, then in a situation where the energy consumption of a warship was decreasing by the day, typical long-range weapons on the battlefield, such as self-propelled cannons or fiber-optic guided rockets, would find it very difficult to hit a mecha that was evading at extremely high speed. If that day really came, then in a war between the Federation and the Empire, other than the warship suspended in space as a deterrent, these extremely mobile military mecha would no longer be used for special operations. They could also be placed on the battlefield as the main force for advancement. Without a doubt, this would be a fundamental change in the nature of war. Currently, only 14 prototypes of the MX mecha developed by Shell Motor Company Engineering Department and the federal military had been produced. However, the production speed demonstrated in the laboratory had already satisfied all parties. It would take at least 2 years for this new batch of mecha to undergo mass production and become a true fighting force. Moreover, the federal military did not know whether the Empire had made any breakthroughs in the multi-engine technology of the mecha. Thus, the federal military had given the Shell Motor Company an exceptionally strict time limit. Between the Federation and the Empire, no matter which side was the first to possess this type of high-performance mecha and throw them into battle, they would definitely win the initiative of the war. The Federation had an old saying, "Lose a nail, break a hoof. Break a hoof, break a war horse. Break a war horse, wound a knight. Wound a knight, lose a battle." This type of mythical battle, which could only be seen in movies and novels, had never appeared in the history of the Federation. However, this demonstrated the importance of details and logistics in war. Moreover, the new generation of the MX mecha could change certain forms of war, using the power of technology to bring about changes in the strength of war. Therefore, when the Department of National Defense gave the Shell Motor Company a strict time limit, the head of the engineering department and the engineering staff were not at all surprised. They also understood the significance of the mecha they had developed. If they wanted to leave their name in history as an engineering staff, then the development of the MX mecha this time would definitely be the best opportunity. Time was of the essence. After 10 years of research and development had ended and standard laboratory parameters had been obtained and simulated, the Shell Motor Company Engineering Department sent the 4MX prototype mecha to the Whitewater Company for its subordinate Whitewater Company to use in the regional conflicts in the Bermuda Triangle Star region to obtain first-hand data on the battlefield. The regional conflicts in the Bermuda Triangle Star region had never stopped, and the experimental weapons planet chosen by the Whitewater Company was also far from the parts of the Empire where spies could infiltrate. All of this was for the sake of secrecy. Even so, the federal military still sent out the most powerful warship of the 3rd Military Region to follow the Whitewater Company's combat team from afar and enter the Bermuda Triangle Star region. On one hand, it was to cooperate with the Shell Motor Company Engineering Department in collecting data, and on the other hand, it was naturally for the sake of secrecy. On that barren mineral planet, all the refugees and thugs who could come into contact with the new MX prototype mecha had to die in the end. For the birth of a new generation of mecha to require the protection of a fleet, this fully demonstrated the importance of this matter to the Federation. The small group of thugs on that barren mineral planet was eliminated by the Whitewater Company's combat team in 7 days. Under the lockdown of the 3rd Military Region's fleet, this news was not leaked and did not attract the attention of any other forces. However, when the engineers of the Shell Motor Company Engineering Department carefully calculated the data of the new mecha on the battlefield, they discovered a very fatal problem. If this problem was not solved, the Federation's new generation of mecha, the MX, could only stand quietly in the laboratory forever and never become a powerful weapon in the battle between the Federation and the Empire. This difficult problem alarmed all the senior executives of the Shell Motor Company's Board of Directors and Engineering Department. It angered the federal military, who had been waiting excitedly for the results of the experiment. Everyone was waiting for the birth of a new generation of mecha, but in the end, they were greeted with such terrible news. The Federation's new generation of MX-type mecha was a top secret among top secrets. Therefore, the research and development work for the past 10 years was basically done by the Shell Motor Company Engineering Department alone. Although the higher-ups of the Department of Defense occasionally thought about whether they should let the experts from the Guzhong Company, or at least the Husk Institute or the Federal Academy of Science participate in the research, this was because the Guzhong Company's multi-engine design was undoubtedly the world's leading technology. However, due to the reasons of secrecy, these ideas were not implemented in the end. Last autumn, the Whitewater Company's battle experiment on the edge of the Bermuda Triangle Star field exposed a fatal problem with the new generation of MX-type mecha. The Shell Motor Company Engineering Department had been unable to solve this problem, so the Human Resources Manager, Jose, had personally poached people during the spring recruitment. He wanted to find some inspiration from these young, outstanding engineers with no inherent experience. Unfortunately, this batch of outstanding young people had only entered the engineering department for a short period of time. They were unable to provide any help to solve the inherent problem of the new generation of mecha. Moreover, the pressure from the federal military was too great, so the engineering department had no choice but to ask for help from the outside world. When Sulu had first seen that email, he had already been stunned by the genius of the twin-engine design. Those seemingly complex but actually simple lines had already become extremely streamlined in his eyes, giving off an existence of infinite beauty and enjoyment. Before his eyes there was a faint metallic glow. This was the culmination of the collective wisdom of the Federation engineers. Every part of the design had gone through endless deductions and calculations, and could not be changed at all. Or rather, in the eyes of a mature engineer, it was impossible for them to even think of destroying such a beautiful design. The Research Institute had officially joined in the research and development of the new generation of mecha, mainly to solve the problem that the new generation of MX mecha had exposed in battle. However, this was still the Federation's most top-secret and cutting-edge technology, so researchers like Sulu could only obtain the relevant data and blueprints through email. They were unable to fully understand the power model of that prototype mecha. Suli's life interest was in this aspect. Moreover, he now had some hidden reasons to enter the engineering department and have an independent space to research mecha. Thus, these past few days, he had been very attentive to this matter. He was just a junior researcher who had just completed his systematic education. How could he solve a problem that even the best engineers of the Federation could not solve just by relying on these schematics that were as simple as a leopard's skin? If it had been anyone else, perhaps looking at those blueprints and that problem in the email, they would have felt a sense of powerlessness and dejectedly give up. But Sulu knew that he had talent in this area. And even more so, he knew that those blueprints in his mind were an existence that bordered on miraculous. If he could solve the problem of the new generation of MX mecha, for an engineer, this was an irresistible temptation. Thus, in these past few days, Suli's attention was completely focused on the laboratory, using an unimaginable speed to carry out design simulations, calculations, and inferences. The new generation of MX mecha was a groundbreaking dual-engine design, with one main engine and one auxiliary engine. The main engine was like the power output system of previous mecha, driving the mecha's movement speed. Meanwhile, the auxiliary engine was the crux of this system. If the jet design was combined with small wings to assist with balance, the mecha could instantly increase its speed in battle, raising the performance of the entire mecha to a terrifying degree. In the engineering department's laboratory, the dual-engine design transplanted from warship multi-engine technology perfectly fulfilled the designer's original intentions. The new generation of mecha's mobility was fully demonstrated. However, in Whitewater Company's experimental use, after 1.5 minutes of continuous battle, the dual-engine system of the 4 new generation mecha would completely fail. There was even one new generation of mecha that had experienced an irreversible explosion in the midst of an experimental battle. The investigation report after the incident pointed out that there was a major difference between the data collected by the Nutshell Engineering Department in the experiment and the actual battle, resulting in this accident. The new generation of mecha's dual-engine design would enter the full power stage at the end. When both engines were pumping out maximum power, the internal Z4 suction electron jets would experience severe instability in their trajectories. This would cause cracks to appear in the high-strength material of the engine casing, and these cracks would even spread throughout the entire mecha. In the laboratory, the full power stage of the dual engines was basically in a static state. However, in battle, the full power stage would definitely occur during the most intense moments of a battle between military mecha. The instability of the electron jets would be greatly magnified when the mecha was moving at high speed, leading to unexpected consequences. It could be that the engines would simultaneously shut down for self-protection, or it could also be that it would explode. Problems occurring were not scary. After all, this was a new generation of mecha that was epoch-making. Just the adjustments in the laboratory alone could not accomplish everything. The key was to discover the problem. This time, the problem discovered on the planet at the edge of the Bermuda Triangle did not cause the engineers of the engineering department to feel anxious at the start. If there was a problem, there would be a solution. However, when the top engineers of the Federation easily discovered the problem, they were extremely saddened to find that this problem was basically very difficult to solve. Translator, Ryuxinji Editor, H2-2 Mr. Translator, H2-2 Mr. Editor, H2-2 Mr. Translator, Ryuxinji Editor, H2-2 Mr. Translator, H2-2 Mr. Editor, H2-2 Mr. Translator, Ryuxinji Editor, H2-2 Mr. Translator, H2-2 Mr. The power source of a mecha was a high-energy battery. The electron jets converted the power in the power source into electron jets that traveled at close to the speed of light. These electrons would then be shot into the space of the engine, where they would be converted into usable energy. Through the mecha's complex transmission system, the mecha would move. The electron jets were the most intricate part of this system, and also the least eye-catching part. The engineering department's design was still based on the old design. From their perspective, the twin engines only added an additional electron jet channel. There was no fundamental difference. No one would have thought that this normally inconspicuous electron jet would become a dangerous bomb in the new MX-type mecha. Reducing the wave interference between the twin engines was easily accomplished by the engineers, but they had no way of completely dissipating this type of interference in such a tight system. As long as there was a single point of interference, those electron beams inside the normally silent electron jets would suddenly become as sensitive as a virgin. They would either turn their heads shyly or run away, or silently stroke a willow, or tear apart their own clothes in anger with a red face. The problem lay within the Z4 electron jets. With the current level of technology of the Federation, there were many ways to control the trajectories of the electron beams. However, those methods required the use of large-scale equipment, so they could only be installed on a battleship and could not be used on a mecha. Once the high-speed electron beams diverged, they would enter a kind of vortex state. Under the control of a field, they would flow in all directions. If they could figure out the trajectories of the electron beams during the full power phase of the twin engines, then the engineers of the Federation would definitely be able to design the corresponding sensing equipment to redirect these electron jets back into the space of the engines. However, the problem was that the trajectories of the high-speed electron jets could not be measured. In the lost quantum state, the Federation's tens of thousands of years of research would never be able to solve this problem. The development of the new generation mecha of the Federation seemed like it would be ruined by this small electron jet. After experiencing countless failures, Sulu sank into silence. 7 days had already passed. Looking at those complicated blueprints on the holographic screen desktop, he still could not find any direction. The blueprints that flashed through his mind like a dream were indeed of great help to him. Thus, in 7 days he had already tried more than 50 designs. This speed had already surpassed the imaginations of the top designers in Shell Motor Corporation Engineering Department. However, they were still failures. No matter how whimsical the design was, in front of that mischievous electron beam, they were still tangible objects. There was no way to capture their trajectories. He stared silently at the three-dimensional screenshot of the Z4 electron jets on the holographic screen. Suddenly, his brows furrowed. He understood something. In such a small system, it was impossible to capture the electron beams. To solve this problem, they had to predict the trajectories of these electron beams in advance from the moment the electron beams were interfered with. However, the problem was, according to the theories of the Federation's scientific community, the trajectories of high-speed electron jets should be random. How could they predict it? Quantum immeasurable. Subconsciously, Su Li's eyes lit up. His finger clicked open the index tree in the middle of the database. He opened Professor Shen's research results that had not made any progress over the years. Quantum immeasurable dynamics. Old Professor Shen's papers had been published before. The chief editors of the academic journals, as well as the highly respected people in the academic community, only wrote some replies out of respect for this Nebula Award winner. However, no one supported old Professor Shen's views. Sulu silently and quickly checked the research results of old Professor Shen over the years. His eyes narrowed more and more, and became brighter and brighter. As the scientific community of the Federation said, the unpredictability of quantum dynamics was basically an axiom. Although old Professor Shen's theory seemed simple and beautiful, there was not the slightest possibility that they could be proven. Speaking from the opposite side, they could not even be proven false. It was just a beautiful and illusory bubble. However, this bubble was so real in front of Su Li's eyes. He simply moved a chair and sat in front of the table. He forgot about the simulation system modification and began to seriously and interestedly learn Professor Shen's theories from the beginning. A beam of electrons traveling at close to the speed of light, within a certain order of magnitude, after being disturbed by a fixed wave band, what kind of trajectory would it follow? What kind of beautiful flower would it turn into? While Sulu was alone in the laboratory, constantly guessing what kind of flower that beam of electrons would turn into, there were countless researchers like him in the Federal Academy of Science, Shell Motor Corporation Research Institute, and the Engineering Department. All of them were fully immersed in the battle to solve the Z4 electron jet. Most people did not know that this problem was related to the Federation's newest generation of military mecha. After experiencing countless failures, many people gave up. However, Sulu did not give up. This was because he knew that this was a critical moment for the Federation's newest generation of mecha. Speaking of which, it was strange. It seemed that he had a much higher security clearance in the research institute than the average researcher. However, an unexpected incident disrupted the rhythm of Suli's life. Seeing the man in the military uniform walk into the elevator with a gloomy expression, Sulu put out the cigarette in his hand, held it in his hand, and walked into the ward. He looked at the pale and nervous girl on the bed, smiled and said, "Did your family ask you to go back?" Zoyu nodded tiredly and said, "Since the doctor said there's no big problem, I don't want to go back for the time being. You know, the most important thing for pregnant women is their mood. Since you know, then you should make yourself feel better," Sulu advised. For some reason, Zoyu found herself bleeding a little in the bathroom last night. Amidst that scream, Sulu rushed in anxiously and sent her to Wangdu Hospital immediately. After the doctor's examination, it was confirmed that Zoyu was at risk of miscarriage. Sulu was nervous but also a little surprised. Zoyu's health was excellent. Recently, she had completely stopped smoking and drinking. For her to have signs of miscarriage, it could only be something else. Could it be that she was frightened at Linyuan restaurant that day? He looked at Zoyu on the bed. After a moment of silence, he said, "I can understand. You're very nervous right now." Zoyu stared blankly at the snow-white ceiling above her head. After a while she said, "You don't understand. You men will never understand. When a mother finds out that once the child in her womb is born, it can only be an illegitimate child pointed at by others, how terrible her mood is." Sulu was a careful and sensitive person, but it didn't mean that he could read all the thoughts of the people around him. After hearing these words, he was stunned and his mood became heavy. This was indeed a problem that Zoyu and the child in her womb would have to face. If others asked now, he could still say that he was the father of Zoyu's child in her womb. But what about the future? The child would grow up eventually, and Shi Qinghai, he still didn't know if he was still alive. Zoyu retracted her gaze and looked coldly at Sulu. She said, "You said that you would be responsible for me and the child in my womb on behalf of Shi Qinghai. How are you going to take responsibility?" "I don't know," Sulu answered honestly. Zoyu closed her eyes and was silent for a long time. After a long time she said softly, "Forget it. This has nothing to do with you. If I hadn't insisted, maybe you wouldn't have wanted this child in the first place. This is my child. It has nothing to do with you." Sulu suddenly realized that when he was with Zoyu, he would talk more and more. Did this mean that he already saw her as a friend? Looking at the pale-faced Zoyu on the bed, his mood suddenly became gloomy. He subconsciously thought of the words he said to Zhang Xiaoming when they were planning the future. "When the child registers in the future, put my name in the father column." Sulu was a guy who didn't hesitate once he made a decision. In this regard, he really didn't act like a 20-year-old young man. He was more like an old man who had weathered the hardships of life and seen through everything. Zoyu slowly opened her eyes and looked at him with a very strange gaze. After a while she said softly, "Are you really crazy? You can pretend to be the child's father, but you're really going to?" Sulu smiled and didn't say anything. In the quiet Linyuan of Wangdu Hospital, Sulu retracted his gaze from upstairs. The lights in Zoyu's room were turned off. He stood alone in the darkness. Looking up at the starry sky, he saw two bright moons. It wasn't the double moon festival, so there was no ball. He once loved someone, but that person was already dead. He thought in his heart that he would probably never fall in love again. He walked to the trash can and was about to throw in the cigarette, but in his hand when he suddenly stopped. Sulu slowly tore open the filter and tore the sponge inside one by one. He tore the sponge into a thin and fluffy mess. He thought in his heart Uncle was right back then. The life of the people in the Federation was indeed like a mess. What kind of shape will this beam of electrons turn into after it dissipates? In the quiet laboratory, Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked at the constantly changing image on the holographic screen table. The trajectory of the electron beam in the theoretical model was like a child who would never settle down. It was riding a roller coaster with different curves. Sometimes it protruded, sometimes it turned back. Sometimes it was like a flower, but most of the time it was like a cloud of fog. It will turn into a mess. An old voice sounded behind him. An old finger reached over and slowly entered a few extremely unfamiliar parameters into the theoretical calculation model on the holographic screen table. At the same time, a simple formula was added. The finger seemed to have magic. As the parameters and formulas were entered, the chaotic fog of the electron beam on the holographic screen table gradually gathered and overlapped. It became clear and turned into countless fine and uniform lines that stretched and fell. It seemed to have no pattern, but in fact there was order in the chaos. It was like a mess made of a string. As long as the end of the string was pulled, all the directions of the mess could be determined. Chapter 175. This was indeed an inconceivable feat today. In Shell Motor Corporation Engineering Department, the Research Institute, and even the Federal Academy of Science, there were countless experts and scholars working hard to solve the problem of the Z4 electron jets. They could not sleep at night, and their food was tasteless. Who would have thought that an old man who had been away from the Federation's academic center for so many years, and who only had the old story of a Nebula Award winner left to him, would be able to solve this problem so easily? The electron beam composition on the screen desktop had gradually stabilized. It looked like a tangled mess, complex but stable. Sulu knew that predicting the trajectory of the electron beams in advance did not mean that all the problems had been solved. First, calculations and verification were needed, and then a series of tests and judgments were needed. Most importantly, a lot of time was still needed to make fundamental changes to the structure of the mecha's engine compartment to target the trajectory of the electron beams. However, most importantly, the most difficult part had been solved. The Federation's new generation of mecha would most likely be successful soon. Because he understood the importance of this matter, Sulu was so shocked that he was speechless for a long time. Only after a long pause did he regain his composure and say respectfully, "Professor Shun, you're back." After staying in the hospital for so many days, he still did not know what illness Professor Shun was suffering from. However, seeing the tired expression on the old man's face right now, he knew that the old man's body had not fully recovered. Professor Shun made a sound of acknowledgement and then headed up to the second floor, seemingly oblivious to the shock that the parameter formula he had entered on the screen desktop would bring to the Federation. Sulu had always been an extremely calm person, but at this moment he still could not completely calm the excitement in his heart. When Professor Shun reached the office on the second floor, he immediately turned around and stared at the mess on the screen desktop. Rubbing his hands together nervously, he immediately began to record and verify the data. He was very afraid that this mess would disappear right before his eyes. Now that they had the trajectory diagram, they would need to modify the MX-type mecha's twin engines to pass through the link. Next, they would need to bring into play Suli's talent in mechanical design. Even though he was unable to fully understand the overall system of the engine, he was still very confident in changing the direction of the particle suction pipe according to the direction of the electron beam. Taking a deep breath, Sulu closed his eyes. In the darkness in front of his eyes, he searched for the light and the blueprints formed by the dots of light. From the library of strange blueprints that was as vast as stardust, he extracted the designs and perfected his own ideas. After an unknown amount of time, Sulu carefully looked at the design drawings on the holographic screen desktop and felt a sense of satisfaction. Although he did not immediately solve the problem of the interference of the two engines, he knew that with the help of Professor Shen, he had already set foot on the road to success. The key was Professor Shen. At this moment his mood was slightly relaxed. Only then did he have the extra energy to turn his confused and shocked eyes back to the second floor. He couldn't help but think, what kind of person is this old professor who hides in the small building and ignores the changes in the Federation? While Sulu was thinking about Professor Shan, this top scientist of the Federation was also facing the holographic screen of the computer, one hand on the crutches in front of him as he pondered about the young civilian second lieutenant downstairs. The flashing data on the holographic screen were traces left behind by external operations in the laboratory's database over the past few days that Professor Shun had been hospitalized. It clearly showed that in the recent days, Sulu had been searching through the data index data in the laboratory alone. In the sidebar of the data trace statistics were the materials Sulu had applied for over the past few days, as well as the operation logs he had carried out in the laboratory. Signal collector? B-section material line? What exactly is this little guy trying to do? Professor Shun's somewhat cloudy eyes gradually lit up. From these logs, he realized that in the days that he was not there, this assistant researcher did not muddle along just because he controlled the laboratory alone. On the contrary, this person was familiarizing himself with the database at an extremely terrifying speed, and was very diligent in carrying out a certain type of research. It was just that even Professor Shin was not familiar with that type of research, so he was a bit curious as to where exactly Suli's research direction was. After opening the email, Professor Shin found out that during the days that he was hospitalized, there were some internal problems in the Nutshell Company. He then thought about the image captured by the electron beam emission track on the holographic screen desktop and understood something. Young people are still interested in those heavy and clumsy metal things. Professor Shin sighed. Professor Shin was once a famous figure in the Federation's scientific community. He was very accomplished in the field of engineering mechanics. Not only was he the winner of the Nebula Award, but he was also the chief designer of a series of mecha. However, many years ago, he put all of his efforts into the seemingly dead end of the research field of quantum measurable dynamics, and then gradually disappeared from people's sight. In the last few years of his life, this old professor's research did not make any breakthroughs, but he was not too disappointed. The Federation's tens of thousands of years of history had long proven that in order to make some kind of leap forward in basic theory, it would either require the tireless research of several generations, or even more than 10 generations, or it would require the appearance of a genius like the 5-person team from back then. It was more likely that the researchers would end up with nothing in the end. Professor Shin did not expect to be able to solve the difficult problem of quantum measurable dynamics while he was still alive. He only wanted to use his own heart to research what he believed to be the most important thing to research, and to provide some suggestions or directions for future generations. However, after so many years, the number of researchers following him had dwindled. After being hospitalized a few days ago, this old professor's mood had changed slightly. He knew that God did not have much time left for him, and everything in this laboratory would probably be forgotten after he died. Although his son was also an outstanding scientist in the Federation, the direction of his research was completely different from his own. Moreover, Professor Shin knew very well that his son had always held a suspicious and sad attitude towards his research over the years. If he was not his father, perhaps his son would have been more direct and sarcastic with his words. Professor Shin looked at the computer screen. Suli's learning records and the last 3 days of the design were left behind. A glimmer of light gradually appeared on his old face. Every research assistant that followed him had a higher level of authority than the other research assistants in the Husk Institute. This was something that Sulu had never understood. In the past, when those research assistants completed the tasks assigned to them by Professor Shin, they would also carry out some of their own research on a whim. However, there had never been anyone like Sulu, who could devote all of his time to research. The records on the screen clearly showed how diligent Sulu had been in his work in the past few days when Professor Shin was not around. This was especially true when he saw that Sulu had once entered the index tree in the middle to study the quantum measurable dynamics theory that he was researching. A gratified smile flashed across the old professor's face. He had never seen such a young researcher who could remain so calm in the midst of a monotonous research career. This was an anomaly. In the past 3 days, Sulu had been designing the modification of the mecha's electronic jets. Although all of them had failed, and even the direction was wrong, to be able to come up with so many excellent designs in such a short period of time was already proof of this young second lieutenant's solid foundation. Professor Shun could even feel the boundless talent in those failed designs, and the following days, Sulu felt that something was off. Professor Shun, who was on the second floor, no longer threw countless calculations and data-gathering tasks at him like before. He suddenly had a lot of free time. Of course, he treasured this time very much. He seized every opportunity to throw himself into the modification and design of the twin-engine electronic jets. Vaguely, he felt that Professor Shen knew what he was doing, and was purposely making time for him. The modification and design of the electronic jets proceeded very smoothly. With the support of Professor Shen's theories, Sulu could be said to have discovered the direction of the Great Path of Light earlier than the other researchers in the Federation. Occasionally thinking about these two matters, Sulu could not help but feel gratitude and respect for the old professor upstairs. One day, in the area of calculating the trajectory of the R-shaped electron beam, Sulu fell into a dilemma. He thought for a long time, then stood up from the holographic screen table and walked towards the second floor. "I've been waiting for you to come find me." Professor Shen sat behind his desk and took off his glasses. He smiled at Sulu and said, "A person who does not have the courage to ask about research has no future." Sulu smiled somewhat awkwardly. He walked forward and presented the problem he had encountered to Professor Shen. At this time, he noticed that although Professor Shen had been discharged from the hospital for a few days, his body seemed to still be weak. However, the old man's spirit seemed to be more vigorous. "In the last few years of my life, I basically dealt with these tiny particles. The accelerators in the Academy of Sciences are as familiar as my children. But at this moment, I have to admit that the quantum size is still unpredictable." Professor Shen did not immediately discuss the electron beam problem with Sulu. After a moment of silence, he spoke with a hint of loneliness. Sulu paused for a second and felt a slight chill in his heart. But under certain fixed conditions, the trajectory of quantum dynamics can be vaguely calculated. And as long as the probability is large enough, we can roughly assume that the trajectory is correct. Professor Shen looked calmly at Sulu. His pair of cloudy eyes gradually shone with the light of wisdom. He did not know whether Sulu could understand or not. He only knew that the things he was researching needed a young person to be able to save them for him. Although the young people of today, including Sulu in front of him, may not have much interest in such boring physics knowledge, at least if his hard work could be saved, it would be of some use in the future. There are no problems with the twin engines designed by those fellows in the engineering department. As long as you can solve the problem of the trajectory of the electron beam in the jets, then the Federation's newest generation of mecha will be successful. Sulu listened intently. This was the conclusion he had made a long time ago. He just did not understand why the old professor would say this. "Remember to sign my name on this academic report." "My name has to be at the very front," said Professor Shen. Sulu frowned slightly. He knew that Professor Shen was not a person who craved academic fame, or else he would not have hidden in this laboratory for so many years. Moreover, regarding the design and modification of the mecha this time, the most crucial foundation was Professor Shen's theory. He did not show any displeasure. On the contrary, he vaguely understood that Professor Shen was trying to protect him. This design that was destined to shock the Federation's academic community might perhaps bring about some unpredictable future for him. Chapter 176. Sulu knew how to answer. 2 years ago, he was still an apprentice on a remote mining planet, following a strange uncle to repair electrical appliances. Since he was young, he had a strong interest and talent in the field of mechanical repair. He had also set his life goal of entering the top mechanical company in the Federation. However, when he really became a researcher at the Shell Motor Corporation Research Institute, with the military rank of a civilian second lieutenant, and truly entered the core area of the Federation's research field, he still could not fully adapt to this change in role. Just like the Federation's proverb, when dreams become reality, it will still seem like a dream. The Shell Motor Corporation Research Institute, the 3 major military academies, and the Federal Academy of Science were all part of the same system. For Sulu, this was a foreign world. He was familiar with the metal lines and chip components, but he was not familiar with the operating principles of this world. Hearing Professor Shen's slightly mocking and angry words, he fell silent. Only now did he understand that the seemingly pure academic world was not fundamentally different from the Jianghu that the orphans of the Donglin district mingled in. Speaking of which, it was true. Things like power were applicable in the universe. Those who were already standing at the top would not allow a small character like himself to obtain enough capital through the success of the Federation's new generation of mecha. You don't have to worry about anything. At least I'm still alive. Looking at the silent Sulu, Professor Shen suddenly thought of himself many years ago. He smiled bitterly and said, I think, whether it's the Academy of Science or the Research Institute, those fellows who have left the front line of research for a long time probably don't have the guts to steal my things. Sulu smiled with some difficulty. While I'm still alive, I'll quickly get this done. Professor Shen put his glasses back on, bent over the table, and began to use his trembling fingers to lightly tap on the problem Sulu had encountered. Sulu did not disturb Professor Shen any further and quietly walked down the metal stairs. That afternoon, he saw Professor Shen's opinion on the holographic screen desktop. The problem that had troubled him for 3 hours became so clear after a few simple words of analysis. He easily found a breakthrough. Even as he marveled inwardly, Sulu could not quite understand why the old professor would suddenly be so willing to help him. Moreover, the other should clearly know that these things involved the new generation of mecha for the Federation, but had little to do with the theoretical research that the old professor was most concerned about. In the following days, Professor Shen and Sulu, two eccentrics, one old and one young, kept repeating the process of researching, designing, encountering obstacles, inquiring, referencing, and solving problems in a quiet and undisturbed laboratory in the Research Institute behind the first military academy of the Federation. The main work was done by Sulu, but Professor Shen was the one who was actually giving them directions. The old professor still spent most of his time in the office on the second floor. He seemed to be sorting out some information. The rest of his time was spent teaching Sulu outside of work. Sulu and Professor Shen quickly became familiar with each other. Occasionally they would drink tea and sit together to chat. However, the content of their conversation would definitely be considered rather boring to an outsider. When it comes to studying, you actually have to go to extremes. Professor Shen sat on the stairs on the second floor, a cup of hot tea placed beside him. He said in a trembling voice, "Back then, after I graduated from University 1, I directly entered the Husk Institute as an assistant. Later on, I made some achievements and entered the Academy of Science. I once had many glorious moments. For example, when that generation of mecha officially came off the assembly line, I was also very excited. However, when I got older, I finally understood that the mission of a scientist was not to develop machines that could kill people faster and more efficiently." Professor Shen took a sip of tea and sighed. The development of science will definitely make weapons more advanced, but the goal of scientific development is not to do so. It is to go to extremes. Large to the extreme is the universe. Small to the extreme is the quantum. Professor Shen did not look at the dazed Sulu downstairs. He continued, "In the field of astrophysics, I am not very good at it. The creation and destruction of the universe will ultimately return to the realm of philosophy. However, I am also very bad at philosophy, so in the end, I set my sights on measuring the dynamics of the quantum. I always thought that everything in the universe should have a pattern to follow, or perhaps it should be said that there is a reason to speak of. However, in the end I realized that the smallest is the largest. It still has to return to the realm of philosophy. I said before, I am very bad at philosophy." Professor Shen was like a child, sitting at the bottom of the stairs on the first floor as he spoke with a laugh. Sulu sat on a chair on the first floor, a smile also appearing on his face. This kind of pure conversation without any other things was very interesting for people like them. In the entire Federation academic community, no one knew that the two people in this laboratory were currently researching the difficult problem that the Federation's newest generation of mecha were facing. Even more so, no one knew that their research progress had long left everyone else far behind. These past 2 days, Sulu and Professor Shen had been able to drink tea and chat frequently precisely because he had confirmed that their direction was correct. It would not be long before the modification work on the new MX Mecha's electronic jets would be completed. The Federation's most difficult problem had gradually become ridiculously simple in front of these two people. The reason it was so easy was partly because Professor Shen had absolute experience and results in the field of measuring the dynamics of the quantum. Although those were just side results from his long research journey, they were already enough to provide strong theoretical support for the problems that had arisen in the new generation of mecha's power system. Those theoretical data models might have needed to be studied from scratch by other researchers, but on Professor Shen's side, they were all ready-made things. As for the other part, that was Su Li's strong learning ability and practical ability. Transforming a theoretical data model into a real design process was a very crucial part. Even an engineering department would need to spend a large amount of time performing repetitive calculations to be able to draw up the most probable structural blueprint. These past few days, Professor Shen had given Sulu many surprises, and Sulu had also given the old professor countless surprises. This young researcher was like a database that had gathered the wisdom of the Federation's engineers. For every data model, he would always be able to find a matching real design in the shortest amount of time. This kind of ability could not be explained. It could only be called a gift. Professor Shen looked at the young fellow downstairs and could not help but think to himself with a smile, what exactly was in this child's brain? Suli's brain was filled with the practical ability that Uncle Fengyu had taught him, the bold and imaginative design concepts, and in the deepest recesses of his mind were the endless structural blueprints that the Black Dream had given him. Until today, he still thought that these high-level structural blueprints were a legacy that Uncle Fengyu had left for him. He had no idea that these blueprints were actually the greatest existence in the Federation, the most profound wisdom, the central computer of the Bureau of Proclamation, which was located who knew how many kilometers underground, had bestowed upon him this wealth in order to awaken him. The Federal Central Computer stored all the high-level structural designs that had existed for tens of thousands of years. Although these structural designs might not necessarily be able to be turned into reality, the fact that they could appear in the central computer meant that their standards were naturally incomparably profound. Under these conditions, Sulu already possessed all the qualifications to become the most outstanding engineer in the Federation without question. Moreover, these qualifications that he possessed were so unique that they could not be replicated. From an apprentice, he was about to become the one who decided the fate of the most advanced mecha in the Federation. Suli's mood was relaxed and joyful, but he could not help but feel a little perplexed. He reflexively fished out a cigarette from his pocket and lit it, but he immediately remembered that the old professor was looking at him from upstairs. He raised his head awkwardly and saw Professor Shen's eyes light up. The two fingers resting on his knees slowly spread open. "I haven't smoked in a long time." Professor Shen took a deep drag on his cigarette and unskillfully blew out a broken smoke ring. In his early years, when he was addicted to nights in the laboratory, this top scientist of the Federation was also used to never leaving his hand without a cigarette. However, when the war between the Federation and the Empire broke out, Professor Shen resolutely gave up smoking for the sake of the slogan, working healthily for the Federation for 50 years. In the blink of an eye, it had already been several decades. The old man and the young man sat on the metal staircase on the second floor of the laboratory, smoking cigarettes and chatting idly. They were very much like the bored passers-by at the entrance of a supermarket in the capital's special district. However, Professor Shen was looking at all the details in the laboratory. Everything here had been pieced together by him bit by bit. Sulu was sizing up Professor Shen from the corner of his eyes. The yellowish-brown spots on the old man's face were getting darker and brighter. In the past few days, the professor's spirits had been extremely good. But Sulu kept feeling that there was a bad omen in his heart that night. Sulu returned to his apartment in Wangdu. After washing Zoyu's hair, he shut himself in his bedroom and lay on the bed with his eyes open. He stared at the ceiling above his head in a daze. The endless pictures in his mind moved according to his will. It was a map of the Donglin district full of mines and green fields. Naturally, he thought of Uncle Fengyu. In the past few days, he had spent all day and night with Professor Shen and received a lot of sincere praise. Only now did he truly understand how much Uncle Fengyu had taught him during his days at the repair shop in the Donglin district, when he taught him how to repair home appliances. Sulu felt that his luck in life was pretty good. Although his life was a bit messy, starting from the Donglin district, he often met some nobles. The so-called nobles were people who sincerely helped him. Uncle Fengyu was like that, and so was Professor Shen. The next day, he walked into the research institute in silence as usual. However, as he walked in, his mood became strange. This was because the colleagues he met on the way, besides greeting him, all looked at him with a very complicated gaze. In front of the laboratory door, he saw a few officials in military uniforms. They were probably the supervisors of the technical department of the Shell Motor Company. Without the authorization of the chip, these officials could only wait outside the laboratory door. Second Lieutenant Sulu? Yes. Let me inform you of something. Su Li's hands clenched tightly. He could not believe the news he had just heard. The breakfast in the paper bag in his hand was slightly distorted by his grip. This was a small yellow pancake for Professor Shen. Yesterday, the old professor had said that although his teeth were not in good condition, he really wanted to eat this. Chapter 177. It was only recently that Su Lu and Professor Shen had become familiar with each other. Unfortunately, the time they had spent together was too short. Professor Shen had already left this world. He stood at the entrance of the laboratory in a daze. It took him a while to digest the shocking and sad news. Professor Shen was already very old. His health had always been poor. Last month he had been hospitalized for a long time. Recently, when Su Lu sat on the metal stairs and chatted with him, he could always smell a hint of inauspiciousness from the old man's seemingly exuberant energy. However, he still did not expect that this respectable old professor would pass away so quickly. Birth, aging, illness, and death came so suddenly and without reason. Su Lu was still immersed in this slightly frustrated and sad mood. His silence made the expressions of the several officials at the entrance of the laboratory a little ugly. One of the officials frowned and said impatiently, "What are you waiting for? Hurry up and open the door of the laboratory." These words pulled Su Lu out of his sad mood. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the several indifferent officials in front of him. Only then did he realize that the situation today was a little strange. Professor Shen's death was indeed a big deal. However, there was no reason why the high-level officials of the research institute, especially the technical director who was directly responsible to the board of directors, would personally come to the laboratory to inform an inconspicuous assistant researcher of the news. Since these people did not specifically come to inform him of Professor Shen's death, and were in such a hurry to enter the laboratory, it was natural that they had other motives. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the indifferent faces of these officials. It was obvious that they did not feel the slightest bit of sadness because of Professor Shen's death. This kind of behavior made Su Lu feel heavy and slightly angry. "Why do you want to open the door of the laboratory?" After a moment of silence, Su Lu directly answered. This answer was obviously not expected by the several high-level officials. They frowned and looked at Su Lu as if they were looking at garbage. One of them said coldly, "When the higher-ups do things, do they need to explain the details to you?" "No need." Su Lu lowered his head slightly and replied, "But this laboratory belongs to the scope of co-construction. According to the agreement, unless Professor Shen agrees or the board of directors issues a written order, I can't open the laboratory and let you in." "Get your facts straight. I'm the director of the 3rd Division of the Research Institute. This person beside me is the technical director of the board of directors." The official was stunned. He didn't expect the assistant researcher in front of him to reject his request so calmly and confidently. He angrily reprimanded, "Open the door for me." Su Lu shook his head and stood at the entrance of the laboratory. He didn't take out the electronic keycard and scan the chip. After working at the Husk Institute for so many days and chatting with Professor Shen, he already knew how the Husk Institute cooperated with the famous professors. The Husk Institute provided the relevant research conditions to these professors, and the final research results were shared between the two parties according to the agreement. This was a relatively free cooperation model, which was more suitable for professors who liked freedom to use their abilities. What's more, Professor Shen was basically in the periphery these years, and he didn't provide any research results to the Federation. The technical support provided by the Professor Shen was extremely limited. Even the tools and materials in the laboratory were privately sponsored by Professor Shen. Without the authorization of Professor Shen or a written order from the company, no one was allowed to enter the laboratory. In this case, why did the company's top officials suddenly appear at the entrance of the laboratory and are so anxious to go in? Su Lu understood the reason behind this, but because of the indifference shown by the other party, and the feeling that something was wrong, he silently blocked the entrance of the laboratory. "Who do you think you are? How dare you block my way?" The director of the 3rd department of the institute looked at Su Lu in front of him with his head down, as if he didn't hear him and didn't see him. He suddenly felt embarrassed and pointed his finger at Su Li's nose and scolded loudly, "This is the last time I'm telling you. Hurry up and open the door of the laboratory and hand over your electronic keycard." You don't have to come to work tomorrow. You are a senior officer, but even if you want to fire an active soldier, you don't have the right to do so. Sulu raised his head and calmly looked at the several officials in front of him, and said, as a soldier, I have to do things according to the rules. Where are the military police? The director's eyes emitted a cold light. He didn't want to waste time with this strange low-level researcher. He looked at Sulu and said angrily, the laboratory is the property of the company, the property of the Federation. Do you think it's yours or old Shun's? Do you think you can't enter the institute if you don't open the door? With the powerful strength of the Husk Institute, it was no doubt very easy to open the electronic door of a laboratory. Today, when these officials heard the news of Professor Shun's death, they rushed to the laboratory immediately. They didn't choose to enter directly, but instead waited for Sulu's arrival. Naturally, they didn't want this matter to be solved in a more peaceful and discreet way. However, they didn't expect this young researcher to unexpectedly block the door so valiantly and not let them enter. The officials had lost their patience and directly called for the military police. There's no need for the military police, I can walk by myself. Sulu's voice became louder, and it echoed in the quiet corridor. Gradually, many researchers wearing white coats walked out of the adjacent laboratory. The crowd looked at the conflict with puzzled eyes. Sulu looked at the arrogant and angry officials in front of him and said loudly, Professor Shun's body is not cold yet, and you want to force your way into the laboratory? Are you planning to steal something? Unless you show me a written order from the board of directors, don't expect me to open the door for you. Everyone knows that when the person is gone, the coffee will naturally be cold. But Professor Shun has just passed away, and you can't wait to come here. Don't you think you are a bit too shameless? At this time, Sulu's mood was unusually cold. He still hadn't gotten over the sad news of Professor Shun's death, and now he had to face these hateful officials. However, the anger and shame on his face were fake. Today, he said so many words like a hot-blooded young man. It was because he knew that a mere civilian second lieutenant, an assistant researcher who had just joined the company for a few months, could not stop the company's management from entering the laboratory, so he had to make his voice louder and let more people know about this. Both sides of the long corridor were full of laboratories. The staff of the research institute were not people who liked to watch a scene, but they all knew the news of Professor Shun's death last night. At this moment, they found that Professor Shun's assistant was arguing with the company's management, so they all cast worried eyes. They understood what happened and looked at the officials with disdain. Although they didn't know what was in Professor Shun's laboratory, the company wanted to seal the laboratory as soon as the professor passed away. From an emotional point of view, it was really difficult for them to accept. At this time, a team of fully armed military police, after receiving the order from the management, rushed from the end of the corridor to the door of the laboratory. They vigilantly surrounded Sulu, ready to subdue him at any time. At this time, the technical chief of the board of directors of the Nutshell Company, who had been silent, whispered a few words in the ear of the director of the 3 departments. Probably these senior officials were not willing to go too far in the current situation. Sulu narrowed his eyes and did not give these officials a chance to turn around in front of the crowd. He directly said loudly, if you have the ability, then force the door of the laboratory open today. If you don't follow the rules, then I will appeal according to the rules. I will sue the board of directors. If it doesn't work, then I will sue the Ministry of National Defense. If even the Ministry of National Defense is nothing in your eyes, then I will sue the Supreme Court. Don't underestimate my determination. After saying this, Sulu did not look at the faces of the senior officials that were getting worse and worse. He directly pulled away the guns in the hands of the military police and walked out of the corridor without looking back. He tightly held the bag of small yellow pancakes in his hand, and thought about what Professor Shun said yesterday. Everything in the universe should be reasonable. Walking to the empty and quiet parking lot of the Research Institute, not far from the military police who were monitoring him, Sulu silently dialed a number. A few days ago, when he was smoking and chatting with Professor Shun, Sulu got the old man's phone number. Thinking that the owner of the number had left this world, he naturally felt sad. Then he heard a voice from the other side of the phone. In the special ward area of the Chester Private Hospital, Sulu silently looked at the car that was pushed into the cold room. Thinking about the peaceful face of the old man in the car, He took off the military cap on his head, held it in his arms and bowed deeply. Father passed away very peacefully. Professor Shun's eyes were slightly red. He smiled and said to Sulu, actually, when he was hospitalized last time, the doctor had clearly told him that he would not last for more than a few days. Sulu thought about the work he had done with Professor Shin in the laboratory a few days ago. Now that he thought about it, he did not feel that the old man was gradually approaching death. Death is something that everyone will face. Professor Shin lowered his head and said, "In the last few days when Father came home, he was in a good mood. I think it should have something to do with you. Thank you." Sulu did not know how to respond to this sentence, but he fell into a complicated mood. Facing the inevitable death, counting the last bell, the old man still calmly taught him and helped him. What kind of state was this? My relationship with Father was not very good in the past. It was probably because when he was young, he was always working for the Federation and neglected his family. When Mother died, he was not by her side. Professor Shen raised his head and looked at the closed door. He thought about his father, who was separated by a wall, and his voice became sad. I used to hate him very much, but later when I was doing the same work I understood a little. That is why I did not marry. People like us who have dedicated our lives to science may not have the right to have a normal family life. Professor Shen turned around and said calmly, "Father changed his will 2 days ago. The laboratory in the 3rd department of the Research Institute will be given to you to continue using. Except for the relevant database rights in the agreement, which may be returned to the Federation, the other results of Father's research as well as the data and materials, he left them all to you." Chapter 178. Why me? These past few years the Research Institute, First Academy, and the Academy of Science have all transferred over 40 research assistants to Father's lab, but none of them lasted for more than 3 months. This is because everyone knows that the direction of Father's research has no future. Professor Shin gazed at Sulu with a gentle gaze and said, "Other than their daily work, those research assistants were not even interested in Father's research on quantum dynamics. Before Father passed away, he said that in all these years, you were the only one who had taken the initiative to flip through the things he had researched." Sulu lowered his head in silence, a trace of guilt growing in his heart. When he had first entered the lab, he had not been any different from those research assistants. It was only because he was used to being squeezed dry by Uncle Fengyu that he had been more proactive and diligent in his work. As for the field of quantum dynamics that Professor Shin had researched, Sulu had not had any interest in it. If it were not for the fact that the Federation's newest generation of mecha had encountered a problem that coincided with Professor Shin's research, he might not have even opened that index tree. Thinking of this, a light flashed through Sulu's mind. Vaguely, he seemed to have guessed why those senior technocrats had been so eager to enter the lab after Professor Shin had passed away. However, he still could not confirm this point. Seeing that the young assistant had fallen silent, Professor Shin thought that the young assistant would not be able to accept the sudden news. He smiled and said, "What I research is deeper veins. The direction of my research is completely different from Father's. The things in that lab are useless even if he left them to me. If he left them to you, at least Father will be able to account for the 10 or so years he spent researching alone." After a moment of silence, Sulu told the other about what had happened at the Research Institute this morning. After all, the other was Professor Shun's son. Whether it was from a legal standpoint or from a personal standpoint, he needed Professor Shin to give him an opinion on the unreasonable demands of those senior technocrats. "I'm afraid I won't be of much help in this matter." A trace of pain appeared in Professor Shun's calm eyes. Like his father, he devoted himself to research. His father left everything in the laboratory to Sulu, and he had no objection. However, when he heard that the company's bureaucrats wanted to force their way into the laboratory before his father's body was even cold, he still felt sad and angry even though he didn't know what those bureaucrats wanted. "Here are some files, some of my father's work notes, and some legal documents. I didn't read it carefully, but the agreement that Father signed with the Husk Institute should be in there." Professor Shen handed Sulu a micro-storage device and seriously said, "If you really want to go to court in the future, let me know. I'm willing to testify for you." People who engage in research are always more naive. The husk company represented the will of the entire Federation. At least, the several senior officials who suddenly appeared this morning represented the will of some of the forces in the Federation. Whether it was Professor Shen or Su Lu in front of this force, they all seemed so small and pitiful. Su Lu believed that if those officials really wanted to enter Professor Shen's laboratory, they would have countless ways and reasons to do so. Professor Shen's request to testify in court would probably never become a reality. The officials simply wouldn't let this matter go to court. A glass of white wine spilled on the table. This was the custom of the Donglin district. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the wine stains on the table. He remembered what Professor Shen said that day. While I'm still alive, I'll do it. However, Professor Shen had suddenly passed away just like that. Su Li's eyes narrowed more and more. The conjecture he had in the hospital gradually surfaced in his mind. It became clearer and clearer, more and more realistic. It looked like the researchers of some departments had probably gradually discovered the importance of Professor Shen's research results in the process of developing the new generation of mecha for the Federation. Other than the development of the new generation of mecha for the Federation, what else could make those officials so nervous? They actually wanted to force their way into the laboratory right after Professor Shen's death. Subconsciously, Su Lu took out a thin piece of small yellow pancake from the paper bag beside him. He slowly chewed on it and poured himself a glass of wine. The wine was mixed with the aroma of grains, giving off a spicy and painful taste. He took a deep breath and made up his mind. No matter what those officials thought, and no matter whether he could protect the laboratory, at least the electron jet must be successfully developed in his hands. On the new generation of mecha for the Federation, Professor Shen's name must be written. Su Lu was a calm and collected person. In the past few days, his emotions had been stirred by the new generation of mecha. That was because he liked it, because it was his life's dream. Moreover, he needed to use the success of the mecha to help himself achieve a certain goal. Other than that, his heart was like a boulder. However, the person had already passed away. What belonged to Professor Shen should belong to Professor Shen. What belonged to him should belong to him. For an orphan who was like a rock in Donglin, there was no one to snatch. Things could be shared. If someone snatched it, then he would snatch it as fiercely as a cub. What happened? Zhou frowned and looked at Su Li's solemn expression. She looked at the wine on the table and the others' furrowed brows because of the spiciness. She knew that something must have happened to this ordinary young man today. Professor Shen has passed away due to illness. Even without chatting with Su Lu, Zhou knew who Professor Shen was. There were not many Nebula Award winners left in the Federation. She was silent for a moment and then turned on the television. The news was broadcasting the news of Professor Shen's death. This old man who was far away from the Federation's academic center and had gradually been forgotten by the citizens of the Federation had finally shocked the numb world. In an instant, many people remembered Professor Shen's outstanding contributions to the Federation back in the day. Su Lu did not look at the news. He only listed out his goal and process in detail in his mind, analyzing where he had gone wrong and where he could make up for it. Suddenly, he stared blankly at Zhou on the sofa for a very long time. Zhou was not used to being stared at by him and said coldly, "What's wrong with you?" "Professor Shen has been helping me research something recently. Specifically, this thing involves the success of the Federation's new generation of mecha." Su Lu drank another glass of strong wine and narrowed his eyes. He told Zhou everything that had happened in the past few days. Zhou became more and more engrossed as she listened. Her eyes lit up. As the daughter of the Deputy Minister of National Defense, she was not an ignorant and incompetent person. Of course, she knew that what Su Lu was saying now was of great significance to the federal military, and even to the war between the Federation and the Empire. The more important the matter was, the more benefits it would bring and the more attention it would attract. Zhou was silent for a long time before she suddenly said, "Since the Husk Institute places so much importance on your laboratory, it looks like many people already know that the success of the new mecha cannot be separated from Professor Shen's research. The problem is, we don't know how much those people know. Is it because their research has run into problems and they need the information from Professor Shen's laboratory? Or is it because they already know that you are close to success and want to snatch the fruits of your labor?" After so many days of interaction, Zhou had already naturally referred to Su Lu and himself as we. Su Lu thought for a while and said, It should be the former. No one can protect the laboratory. Zhou looked at him seriously and said, "You are an employee of Nutshell and also a civilian soldier directly under the Ministry of National Defense. No matter what your identity is, you are just a small fry." Sulu looked at her quietly. "Don't look at me. My father is indeed a soldier with a technical background. He should have some influence on Nutshell, but this matter, the benefits involved are too great." Zhou lowered her eyes slightly and said, "Even if you ask Lady Tai to help, those people will not give up. You seem to have guessed which important person wants to snatch Professor Shan's things." Zhou hesitated for a long time before saying softly, "The Federal Academy of Science. Dean Lin." Sulu frowned. He could not believe his ears. In the hearts of the average citizen of the Federation, the Federal Academy of Science was an incomparably noble and holy place. Dean Lin's prestige was even higher. Back when Sulu was a mechanic, he had also greatly admired the expert who had single-handedly taken on the task of developing the M52 mecha. Dean Lin is the youngest Nebula Award recipient in history, 11 years earlier than Professor Shen. But there has always been an unconfirmed rumor. Back then, Dean Lin and Professor Shen worked in the same laboratory. Dean Lin's Nebula Award recipient results were plagiarized from Professor Shen's research. The head of the Academy of Science plagiarized? Can a person really be that shameless? Sulu frowned. Zhou raised her head and said calmly, "It's just a rumor. No one has proof and no one dares to bring it up. The position of the head of the Federal Academy of Science is too sensitive, too detached. Neither the politicians nor the military are willing to offend him. To be able to discover the importance of measuring quantum dynamics from the development of a new mecha so quickly, and to be able to link it to the almost forgotten Professor Shan, this person's academic attainment must be extremely high. Moreover, he is very familiar with Professor Shan, and even has been secretly observing him all this time." Sulu lowered his head, thinking seriously. If Zhou's guess was somewhat correct, then he had to admit that the head of the Federal Academy of Science, such a detached figure who was deeply respected by the Federation and whose students were spread across the various key technical departments of the Federation, if he really wanted to steal the fruits of Professor Shen's research, Sulu would not be able to do anything about it. "How far are you from success with the new mecha you're researching?" Zhou looked seriously into Sulu's eyes. She had always thought that this ordinary small-eyed boy was destined to become someone great, but she really had not expected that this person would shock the entire Federation so soon after entering the research institute. "Not far. Give up on the lab," Zhou said straightforwardly. With regards to the darkness of the upper echelons of the Federation, she had a more direct understanding than Sulu, who had come from an ordinary background. "Do your best to create the new mecha. As long as it's done, even if it really is the Federal Academy of Science, you won't have to worry about anything." Sulu knew that she was talking about a more practical method, but he did not want to give up on the lab, because it was the crystallization of Professor Shen's wisdom in his later years. "Although I'm not far from success, I still need the database in the lab. Without the lab, I can't do anything." "Then you have to think of a way to transfer the database out." Zhou looked at him seriously. "Don't have any extravagant hopes. I believe that when you return to the Research Institute tomorrow, you will be transferred out, and in this lifetime you won't be able to take one step closer to the lab." It was an impossible task to move the huge database in the laboratory from the Nutshell Research Institute, which was heavily guarded and had 3 layers of scanning. Although Sulu trusted Zhou's sharp judgment as an unmarried mother, he did not think in this direction. But the next day, when a group of fully armed military police ordered him to report to the Human Resources Department immediately, he understood that he had to do as Zhou said. Sulu looked at the military police in front of him silently. For the first time, he felt that it was difficult to reason with the old system of the Federation. Professor Shen believed that everything in the universe should be reasonable, so he was plagiarized, ostracized, and forgotten in a lonely laboratory. Chapter 179. Since when did the Federation have someone like you who doesn't respect his superiors? The director of the 3rd Department of the Shell Motor Corporation Research Institute held the rank of colonel. He sat on the chair in his office and scolded loudly. He looked at the ordinary-looking assistant researcher in front of him, and thought about how he was stopped by this person at the entrance of the laboratory yesterday. His heart was filled with anger because his authority was being challenged. From today onwards, you are transferred to the logistics department. The director looked at Su Lu with contempt. The way he used his authority to toy with his subordinates made him feel much better. He threw the documents in his hand at Lu Zhou and scolded, "You'll see how I'm going to play you in the next few years." Su Lu picked up the personnel transfer documents from his feet and opened the folder. He found that he had been transferred out of the laboratory area, and his next office was not far from the parking lot. From a researcher to a handyman, there was no doubt that this was a humiliation and a heavy blow. However, his expression was very calm. This calmness made the director feel that something was wrong. Last night, Zhou had already helped him analyze the situation. Although he had the agreement between old Professor Shen and the Nutshell Mobility Company in his hands, and could prevent those people from entering old Professor Shen's laboratory, his people were still under the jurisdiction of the Nutshell Research Institute and the Department of National Defense. With just a personnel transfer order, those people could drive him to the edge of the area, deprive him of his authority, and make him unable to approach the laboratory again. If he couldn't get close to the laboratory, then he naturally couldn't stop those people from entering the laboratory. Su Lu silently closed the folder. He didn't look at the director. He casually saluted him and walked out of the office. Walking in the quiet corridor, the doors of the laboratories opened one after another. The researchers who usually didn't care about the outside world and only knew how to do research all stood at the door. They looked at Su Lu with a complicated expression as they watched him leave. They didn't know the inside story. They only knew that old Professor Shen's last assistant had offended the company's top management and had been sent away at this time. He was also a researcher. A feeling of sympathy for the death of a rabbit pervaded the entire corridor. Su Lu did not pay attention to the sympathetic gazes of these people. He lowered his head slightly and walked towards the end of the long corridor. Even when he passed by the door of his laboratory, he did not stop at all. A few fully armed military police had already taken control of the entrance of the laboratory. If he wanted to rush in now, what awaited him would most likely be bullets. The people at the Federal Academy of Science obviously needed Professor Shen's research results. However, if those people didn't want to attract attention, they would definitely wait until a few days after he left the laboratory. After the whole thing had died down, they would find a way to enter the laboratory. In other words, Su Lu still had some time, but the time was too short, and he had not thought of how to steal the huge database in the laboratory. The security checks at the Research Institute were extremely strict. Every researcher who entered and left had to go through 3 scans. The Federation's current high-end storage devices might be able to transfer the data from the Research Institute's database, but they definitely wouldn't be able to pass the scans. The next day was Professor Shen's funeral. The location of the funeral was chosen at the Milky Way Public Cemetery on the outskirts of the capital. When black cars in 2s and 3s slowly drove along the mountain road to the cemetery, the late spring sky suddenly started to rain. The raindrops pattered, moistening this world that was filled with a peaceful atmosphere. Su Lu held a black umbrella and silently stood behind Professor Shen, blocking the cold rain from the sky for him. His eyes calmly scanned the crowd beside the grave. Although Professor Shen had long been away from the academic center of the Federation, he was still a Nebula Award winner. He had a very high reputation in the academic circle. Now that he had passed away, whether or not they had forgotten his existence, many people still chose to send him on his last journey. The people attending the funeral wore dark clothes, most of them black, with a small white flower pinned to their chests. Under the cold rain in late spring, and against the cold mountain behind the cemetery, it revealed a sad and solemn feeling. Su Li's right hand firmly held the handle of the umbrella, not letting a single drop of rain fall on Professor Shen's shoulder. This old professor was sad about the death of his father, and he had to deal with so many things. He was mentally exhausted to the extreme. The heavy black coffin was slowly lowered into the deep grave. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the coffin. His gaze seemed to penetrate the thick coffin lid and saw the respected old professor, whose face was full of age spots. In the end, he had accompanied him to smoke a cigarette. At this moment, Su Li's heart was even more peaceful and calm. Although until now, he still did not know how to protect Professor Shen's wisdom and prevent it from being stolen by those shameless academic authorities after his death, he knew that he had to do it. Otherwise, he would not be able to face the old man in the grave and himself beside the grave. When Professor Shen knew that Sulu was revising the design of the electron jet and had made great progress, he had warned him of the risks involved. However, the old professor himself probably did not expect that he would die faster than the doctor had expected. He was actually unable to protect Sulu until the successful creation of the new generation of mecha. Sulu retracted his gaze and scanned the people around the grave with a slightly scrutinizing gaze. Some of them were sincere, while others were pretending to be sad. Professor Shen, who was under his umbrella, would not pay attention to this, but he had to. The three major military academies had all sent representatives, especially the dean of the first military academy. However, the board of directors of the Shell Motor Company had only sent an honorary director. What made Sulu feel even colder was that for Professor Shen's funeral, the Federal Academy of Science had actually only sent an office director as a representative. That bald fatty was obviously just a small figure, and did not show any respect at all. It seemed that the rumors that Zhou Yu had said were true. Professor Shen had left the Federal Academy of Science in anger a few decades ago, and the relationship between the two had always been extremely cold. All of this might be related to the unwarranted plagiarism incident. The director who had assigned Sulu to the logistics department was exceptionally active today. There were many important people from the three major military academies. He acted as if he had done countless things for Professor Shen in these past few years. There was still no dirt. The director glanced at the foot of the mountain from time to time, as if he was waiting for someone to arrive. Su Li's eyes narrowed. He saw 3 black cars earlier than the rest of the people in the cemetery. They were driving along the mountain road towards the cemetery. He did not know who was sitting in the cars. The black cars stopped at the entrance of the cemetery. As if to show respect, they did not drive directly towards the cemetery. A few people who looked like government officials surrounded 2 middle-aged men in the middle. They walked towards the cemetery. The crowd around the cemetery was slightly disturbed, and then moved aside to make a path for them. The identities of these 2 middle-aged men were worth the weight of everyone present. After the president's scientific advisor shook hands with Professor Shen, he stood beside the cemetery and read the president's handwritten letter to everyone with a heavy and nostalgic expression. He praised Professor Shen highly for his important role in the development of mecha for the Federation many years ago. Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked at everyone's expressions in the drizzle. He knew that the so-called funeral was just another form of communication, but when he thought of the old professor's body in the cemetery, he always hoped that this kind of communication would end quickly. The president's scientific advisor was naturally the most respected person present, but Sulu did not pay attention to him. He only used the corner of his eyes to size up the high-ranking officer beside the scientific advisor. The high-ranking officer who was not wearing his military uniform today. That person was about 50 years old. His hair was white, his face was heavy and determined, and his eyes were calm and powerful. Although he was wearing civilian clothes, he still gave off the unique aura of a soldier. Deputy Minister of National Defense Zhou Yingxing. He was born a technocrat and had been promoted since the General Equipment Base. He had been promoted 2 ranks consecutively from the Deputy Director of the Logistics Department to the Deputy Minister of National Defense. According to internal news in the capital, if Senator Pabre successfully became the president, this person would undoubtedly be the only candidate for the position of Minister of National Defense. Deputy Minister Zhou had been dealing with the equipment of the federal military all his life. Naturally, he had a close relationship with the academic community represented by the 3 military academies and the Nutshell Mobility Company. Today was the day of Professor Shen's funeral. The federal military would certainly send a representative with great influence. It was only natural that he would show up. Sulu glanced at Deputy Minister Zhou from the corner of his eyes. He remembered that when the Deputy Minister shook hands with Professor Shen, he had also looked at him from the corner of his eyes. His mood became a little strange. The other party must have already known who he was and the child in Zhou Yu's womb. He had speculated many times that he would meet Zhou Yu's father, but he never would have thought that it would be at a funeral after reading Mr. President's handwritten letter. The scientific advisor whispered a few words with Professor Shun and expressed his personal sympathy. Only then did he take off the white flower on his chest and gently put it into the grave. When there was a beginning, there was an end. The people who attended the funeral threw the white flower on their chest into the grave. There seemed to be a layer of white snow floating on top of the black coffin. The scientific advisor left first. The funeral gradually came to an end. Deputy Minister Zhou, who represented the federal military, did not leave. He and the dean of the First Military Academy were whispering something somewhere in the cemetery. Sulu held an umbrella and accompanied Professor Shun to return the greetings to the people. Suddenly, he tightened his grip on the umbrella and slowly turned his head. He saw that somewhere in the cemetery, there was only Deputy Minister Zhou under a tree. The other party was looking at him coldly. There was a hint of scrutiny in his cold eyes. Sulu narrowed his eyes. He did not impolitely look at this important person. Instead, he lowered his head and whispered a few words in Professor Shun's ear. He handed the umbrella to Professor Shun and then walked under the tree in the drizzle. The director of the research institute, who had just sent the scientific advisor away, was about to seize this rare opportunity to get closer to Deputy Minister Zhou. However, he suddenly saw the young assistant, who he had a very bad impression of, walking toward Deputy Minister Zhou. He could not help but stop for a moment. Endless doubts arose in his heart. Chapter 180. The drizzle continued to fall from the sky above the Milky Way cemetery. Sulu walked towards the big tree in the rain. The Deputy Minister of Defense under the tree coldly watched his every step. When he was about 5 meters away from the tree, 2 officers appeared behind Deputy Minister Zhou and watched him vigilantly. Sulu knew that the Deputy Minister of Defense must be surrounded by the best soldiers of the federal military as a safety barrier, but he didn't stop. Even Madmanly couldn't beat him. The military, which was considered strong by the citizens of the Federation, couldn't make Sulu feel too much fear. Sulu didn't stop at all. Deputy Minister Zhou's cold eyes showed a hint of complexity. He casually waved his hands behind his back. Although the movement was small, the 2 Federation soldiers immediately retreated to a place far away in silence. Sulu stood in front of the military boss. After a moment of silence, he said, "Hello, I'm Sulu." Deputy Minister Zhou looked at him calmly for a long time before he said softly, "I'm Zhou Yingxing." There were many factions in the federal military. This was naturally formed through a long history and war. But no matter how you looked at it, Zhou Yingxing, who had absolute influence in military logistics and was moving from the position of Deputy Minister of Defense to the position of Minister, was undoubtedly one of the most powerful figures in the federal military in recent years. Although he only introduced himself softly, his voice was very clear in the rain. It fully revealed the majesty of this military boss. Sulu lowered his head slightly. From the corner of his eyes, he noticed the hateful director not far away. It seemed that he didn't mean to, but in fact he was carefully watching them. He couldn't help but have a thought. Zhou Yu is doing very well now. She doesn't smoke or drink. Her child is also quite good. Sulu went straight to the point. Of course, it was impossible for such a big shot to stay in the cemetery temporarily to look at the mountain scenery in the rain with Sulu. Deputy Minister Zhou did not expect the young man to be so direct. He frowned and said after a moment of silence, "Yuzi was hospitalized a few days ago? It was a sign of a threatened abortion, but it's fine now." In an instant, Sulu felt a strong pressure. The other party might have really thought of him as a hairy son-in-law. If Zhou Yu was not feeling well, then it was naturally his problem. Too much pressure, too nervous. Sulu said immediately. There was no need to say it out loud. What he meant was that the Zhou family was giving her too much pressure. Since she used her own life to bet that child's life, she should know that this pressure was not given to her by her family, but by herself. Deputy Minister Zhou's cold face did not soften at all. He looked at Suli's ordinary face and frowned slightly. The drizzle continued to fall. Although it was not heavy, it was enough to wet the clothes of everyone in the cemetery. Some people had already noticed that Deputy Minister Zhou was talking to a young man under the tree. However, they did not know the specific content of the conversation, so they all got into their cars and left. Professor Shin still had to deal with some other affairs. In the empty and quiet cemetery, there were only a few soldiers scattered around, as well as Deputy Minister Zhou and Su Lu under the tree. Of course, there was also the director of the Husk Institute, who pretended to be hiding from the rain, but could not find a suitable place to hide. The rain fell on the brim of Su Li's military cap, making a slight sound. The rainwater flowed down the brim of his cap and onto his face. He could not help but squint his eyes. Deputy Minister Zhou, who was standing in front of him, still had his hands behind his back. He did not care about the rain falling from the sky at all. Today, Su Lu was wearing a military uniform, while Deputy Minister Zhou was wearing civilian clothes. However, in this strange silence, the two of them gave off the opposite feeling. Deputy Minister Zhou was still the real soldier. After a long silence, Deputy Minister Zhou suddenly said coldly, "You knocked up my daughter, and you still dare to stand in front of me without the slightest trace of shame on your face. There are only 3 possibilities. First, you are an extremely stupid guy who does not know how to spell the word death. Second, you are very confident in yourself and shamelessly trying to use this to gain some benefits. However, this is even more stupid." Su Lu stood upright in the rain and calmly looked at the cold face of Zhou Yu's father. However, he gradually began to feel nervous. The person chosen by Taizian should not be this stupid. Deputy Minister Zhou looked at him coldly and said, "You dare to stand in front of me like this, so it can only be the third possibility." Su Lu didn't know how to respond. He could only stand silently in the rain under the tree and honestly stand in front of this big boss of the military. Deputy Minister Zhou suddenly sighed. He narrowed his eyes in the rain and half-turned his body to look at the misty fog at the foot of the mountain. He slowly said, "After all, you did not discipline your own daughter well. I don't care who you are taking the blame for, but since it is not Taizian, and you took the initiative to take the blame, then you can continue to be the scapegoat." When Su Lu heard the first part of the sentence, he was touched. He thought about how arrogant and cold the Zhou siblings were when he met them in Linhai. As a father, he was indeed a failure in disciplining his children. However, when he heard the second part of the sentence, Su Li's body suddenly tensed up. He suddenly raised his head and stared blankly at Deputy Minister Zhou's face, which had suddenly aged a lot. He did not know what to say. This military boss had actually guessed the truth of the matter so easily. Su Lu looked at him in shock. His hands, which were exposed outside his military uniform, clenched slightly. It was not to be cautious, but to hide the shock in his heart. At this moment, Su Lu finally understood why the most mysterious Tai family of the 7 major families in the Federation had decided a long time ago to fully support the general in front of him. This was definitely not because of the relationship between Taizian and Zhou Yu when they were young. Instead, it was because the military boss in front of him had enough ability and intelligence to win the respect and help of the Tai family's wife. Thinking about that Major Zhou and Zhou Yu, who was now living a pig-like life in the Wangdu apartment, Su Lu couldn't help but feel a little absent-minded. This father was indeed much more powerful than his children. Since you've chosen to take the blame, then continue to do so. Although it's a bit heavy, I'm sure it'll bring you some benefits. Deputy Minister Zhou didn't look at Su Lu. Instead, he stared coldly at the foot of the mountain and prepared to leave. Su Lu lowered his head slightly and quickly digested the previous conversation in his mind. Suddenly, he raised his head and walked forward with a smile. He gently hugged Deputy Minister Zhou's body as if he was an elder. They hugged intimately and politely, then instantly separated. When Deputy Minister Zhou saw that this young man was hugging him, a strange look flashed across his calm eyes. However, immediately after, a strange smile appeared on his face. Not only did he not stop the young man, but he also raised his hand and gently patted Su Li's back. Deputy Minister Zhou and Su Lu separated. The smiles on their faces disappeared and they looked at each other calmly. There was a hint of anger in the deputy minister's eyes because he had been used. However, Su Lu knew that the other party's anger was not very strong, so he was not afraid. He calmly looked into Deputy Minister Zhou's eyes. He thought to himself, since I am going to take the blame for the Zhou family, why don't you take the blame for me too? Yuzi and I will go home to see you in a few days. In the drizzle of the Milky Way public cemetery, the words that Su Lu said to Deputy Minister Zhou were particularly clear, The shameless director of the Husk Institute's third department was sitting in a chair in a daze. Yesterday, at Professor Shen's funeral, he made a very shocking discovery. The young assistant researcher who dared to disobey orders from his superiors and not allow him to enter the laboratory and was sent to the logistics department by him, seemed to have a very close relationship with Deputy Minister Zhou. As an administrative official, this director did not have any achievements in the field of technology that were worth praising. The reason why he was able to continuously rise within the Shell Motor Company was because of his interpersonal relationships. Although the director of the Shell Motor Corporation Research Institute only had to answer to the board of directors, who was Zhou Yingxing. He was the most likely person to take over the position of the Ministry of National Defense after the election. If he offended Zhou Yingxing, he would only have a very miserable ending in the future. When the director thought about the previous phone call to inquire about the news, his face turned extremely pale. That ordinary second lieutenant actually made Deputy Minister Zhou's daughter pregnant. Looking at the scene yesterday, Deputy Minister Zhou did not seem to be very angry with this young man who brought shame to his family. Speaking of which, his daughter was pregnant. What other choice did he have other than marriage? How did that young man named Sulu get so lucky? The director quickly thought in his mind. If Sulu married the daughter of the Zhou family, then he would be the son-in-law of the deputy minister. Next year, he would be the son-in-law of the Minister of National Defense. 2 days ago, he pointed at the son-in-law of the Minister of National Defense and scolded him. Yesterday, he even chased him away to do cleaning work. When the director thought about this, other than cursing Sulu in his heart, he also felt an unprecedented sense of crisis. At this moment there was a knock on the office door. The expression on the director's face suddenly became calm. He looked at Sulu, who pushed the door open and walked in. He put on a smile that he thought was very appropriate and said gently, "Second Lieutenant Su, I know that yesterday's personnel transfer may have caused some misunderstanding. I didn't want to explain anything, but I'm worried that if this continues, there may be some problems." He sighed and said seriously, "The decision to seal Old Shen's laboratory was made by the Academy of Sciences and the Board of Directors. I transferred you away because I don't want you to have any conflicts with them. This is to protect you." Chapter 181. Hearing Su Li's request, the director was taken aback. He did not respond immediately, but instead smiled and said, "Second Lieutenant Su, there are many other research departments in the Research Institute's 3 divisions. Which one are you more interested in?" Sulu didn't answer him. She just lowered her head and remained silent. The atmosphere in the office instantly became somewhat tense. The director used a handkerchief to wipe the cold sweat from his forehead, and said with some difficulty, "This matter is really a little difficult to handle." Although he did not know the inside story, yesterday morning, the technical supervisor of the company had directly requested that Professor Shen's laboratory be sealed. Moreover, there was also the shadow of those big shots from the Federal Academy of Science behind the scenes. He was just an administrative officer, so of course he did not dare to offend the other party. The problem was, the young second lieutenant standing silently in front of him right now did not seem like someone he could offend either. Right then, Sulu repeated, "I'm just going in to take some personal things." The director wiped away the increasing amount of cold sweat on his forehead, his mind turning quickly. He did not want to offend either side, and even more so, did not dare to offend them. If this son-in-law of the Deputy Minister of Defense only wanted to enter the laboratory to finish up some loose ends, the other side would not be too displeased. The Husk Institute's data security measures were excellent. If this person was allowed to enter the laboratory, he would not be able to cause damage to the database and everything in the laboratory without alerting the security department. Thinking of this, the director made up his mind. He raised his head and said seriously, "The board of directors is currently processing the written order. Tomorrow morning. Second Lieutenant Su, if you move quickly, there should be no problem." Sulu nodded and left the office. Although until now, he still had not thought of a way to steal Professor Shen's research results and the repair design of the MX prototype mecha. At least he would be able to enter the laboratory tomorrow. When the time came, he would take one step at a time. If it really did not work out, he would have to use physical methods to destroy all the storage devices. However, if he did that, It would be a pity and a disservice to Professor Shun. In a high-rise building on 7th Avenue in the Special Capital Region, the top floor of the Sanlin United Bank's headquarters was a dome made entirely of high-strength glass. It greedily absorbed the light and heat of the sun, allowing the green plants on the top floor to grow happily. In the spacious top floor of the building, there was only a desk made of black seawood. Behind the desk was a chair, and in front of the desk was a sofa. It seemed particularly lonely, but the person behind the table was very used to this kind of loneliness. His family had stood at the top of the Federation's financial world for countless years. This kind of loneliness was actually a kind of glory. At the age of 27, he was already the vice president of the Sanlin United Bank, and the heir to one of the 7 major families in the Federation. He was used to standing on the top floor of the tall building in the Capital Special District, watching the joys and sorrows of the common people below his feet through the glass. But today he wasn't looking at the scenery. Instead, he looked at the intelligence files on the table seriously. After a long time, he looked up and said calmly, "We must get the data in the 3rd laboratory of the Research Institute. This is Secretary Luo's request." Although the Academy of Science can pressure the Nutshell Board directly, the assistant researcher seems to be a little troublesome. Opposite the desk stood a blond young man in a military uniform. He was Park Ji-ho, an intern at the Shell Motor Corporation Engineering Department. This proud and outstanding young man slightly lowered his head, carefully listening to the instructions of the person behind the table. He didn't dare to look up at the other party. He could get along with the 7th young master of the Li family, Li Xiaotong, like friends, but the real heir of the Li family behind the table was as dazzling as the sun. Park Ji-ho even suspected that if he dared to look at the other party, his eyes would be blinded. How could there be such a beautiful man in the Federation? How could he be so dazzling? Li Xiaozhu was the most beautiful man in the Federation. His eyebrows were as clear and bright as bamboo leaves in a painting. The windshield outside the Sanlin United Bank building was blocked by a glass wall, but that pair of bamboo-like eyebrows seemed to be gently swaying in the wind. He smiled and looked at the cautious Park Ji-ho in front of him, and said, "If you handle this matter well, I will recommend you directly to the Federal Academy of Science. Maybe you can become Dean Lin's student." The expression on Park Ji-ho's face finally changed. He gently clenched his fists that were hanging by his side. When he entered the Nutshell Mobility Company from the military academy, he had always thought that he was outstanding. However, he did not expect that he would always be suppressed by Zhou Yu from the first academy. Then, during the spring recruitment exam, there was the poacher named Sulu directly enter the Federal Academy of Science and become the dean student? This was as wonderful as a dream. The laboratory has been sealed. The written order from the board of directors will be sent the day after tomorrow. I don't understand why you still want to deal with the 2nd lieutenant at this time. Park Ji-ho didn't lose all rational judgment because of this wonderful dream. Li Xiaozhu raised his head, looked at him with a trace of appreciation, and said, "You don't need to understand how I do things. You just need to do it." He didn't explain, but it seemed that the young master of the Li family wasn't unhappy. Park Ji-ho secretly sighed in relief. At this time, Li Xiaozhu lowered his head again and seriously looked at the documents on the desk. He suddenly said, "Since he is the future son-in-law of Minister Zhou, be careful. Don't kill anyone. After the Lin Hai Stadium incident, the Tai family is going crazy. I don't want that old lady to go crazy." Park Ji-ho was silent for a moment, then suddenly said, "In the Linyuan restaurant, that person didn't lose to Madman Li." The meaning of this sentence was very clear. If he didn't use firepower, Park Ji-ho had no confidence that he could take care of that young 2nd lieutenant. Li Xiaozhu didn't explain his thoughts. He just waved his hand. The sunlight seeped in through the glass walls in all directions. The multi-layer glass structure could adjust the angle of the light that entered the building space. The light that entered the building space was not dazzling, nor was it burning. It was just warm and clear. In the empty office, Li Xiaozhu was silent for a long time. Then he walked to the side of the glass wall and looked at the buildings of different heights in the Capital Special District. He was silent for a long time. Ever since the young master of the Tai family left Lin Hai, there was no trace of him. It seemed that after the assassination, the Tai family had become more vigilant and careful. Li Xiuzhu didn't really care about the young master, who wasn't even 20 years old. Although the elders of the family had always maintained vigilance and even respect for the Tai family, he always felt that this kind of family that valued tradition too much was slowly losing its vitality. The Tai family had only one son for 7 generations. This was an advantage but also a fatal weakness. Li Xiuzhu squinted his eyes and looked at the shadow under his feet on the streets of the capital special district. He couldn't help but feel a little envious. At least that brat Taizian didn't have to worry about the distribution of power in the family. However, if this brat died, the Tai family would be finished. Among the 7 families in the Federation, other than the Tai family and the Zhong family, the other 5 families had always faced the problem of the distribution of power. Although these families had a mature inheritance system in the past tens of thousands of years, the conflicts between brothers and sisters wouldn't disappear just because of the existence of the system. Li Xiuzhu chose Park Ji-ho to do this. On one hand, he wanted to remove himself from this situation. On the other hand, he wanted to consider what kind of reaction the 7th son, Li Hyo-tong, would have when he found out that he used his own people. Everyone has their own fatal weakness. Li Xiuzhu looked at the scenery outside the window. He looked at the reflection of his beautiful face on the window and frowned. In his opinion, the fatal weakness of the Tai family was that Tai Ziyuan alone had to take responsibility for the continuation of the entire family. The fatal weakness of the old director of the Federal Academy of Science was that his reputation was too good. As for the Sulu that he had ordered to be dealt with, that was his name, right? Li Xiuzhu didn't consider this person. Although this person seemed to have some ability and was gradually emerging, he was still not worthy of his attention. The son-in-law of the Zhou family? Madman Li didn't defeat him? Professor Shun's student? Li Xiuzhu's eyes showed a trace of coldness. He believed that he was very clear about how terrifying that crazy brat Li's of Philadelphia was. How could there be anyone in the Federation who could be Madman Li's opponent? All of this was just a smokescreen. That old man Li's of Philadelphia had always had a good relationship with Lady Tai. Who knew if Madman Li's actions at Linyuan that day were to create momentum for that chess piece called Sulu? If it was any other time, before he completely understood Su Li's true background, Li Xiuzhu definitely wouldn't have acted rashly. However, the current situation was different. He had to get the data in the Husk Institute's laboratory. Especially after he found out that Su Lu and Minister Zhou had a conversation at the Milky Way Public Cemetery yesterday, his actions had to be faster. He even didn't mind using more violent methods. He didn't want to drag this matter out until Lin Banshan returned from the Great Triangle. Lin Banshan was the person he feared the most in the Federation. The birth of a new generation of mecha in the Federation was a great reputation. There were great benefits involved. A chess piece like Su Lu should have the awareness to sacrifice himself for the greater benefits. Father, the matter has been dealt with. Don't worry. The latest by the day after tomorrow, the data will be transferred to the hands of the Academy of Science. We still need you to put in some more pressure on the nutshell board. After putting down the phone, Li Xiuzhu informed the secretary downstairs. After a moment of silence, he said, "Don't prepare flowers today. Prepare some delicious and normal food boxes. I'm going to Department 23 to pick someone up." In a manor in the southern hemisphere of Planet S1 in the Upper Forest District, an old man put down the phone in his hand. He turned his head and smiled at the 2 guests beside him. Dean Lin will probably return from the moon base the day after tomorrow. The governor of Jingzhou, Ross, smiled and said, "We will remember Mr. Li's support for us. You're too kind." The current head of the Li family raised the wine glass in his hand and turned to the other guest. He said softly, "Mr. Medellin, I admire your genius thinking. You're probably the only one who can capture Dean Lin's heart." Senator Medellin remained silent. The head of the Li family held his wine glass and narrowed his eyes slightly. He was extremely impressed by the political wisdom of this old fox. If at this critical moment in the presidential election, the Federal Academy of Science, which had always been apolitical but held an extremely high position in the hearts of the Federation voters, suddenly expressed opinions that leaned towards their side under the leadership of Dean Lin and even directly joined their electoral camp, what kind of heavy and powerful blow would that be? Chapter 182. To have enough power to pressure the board of directors of the Shell Motor Company and directly seal Professor Shen's laboratory was not something an ordinary person could do. That night, Zhou had directly called out the name of the director of the Federal Academy of Science. That was a guess based on intuition, and a woman's intuition, especially a pregnant woman's, had a very frightening accuracy rate. Su Le could imagine why the Federal Academy of Science was so determined to snatch the work of the Federation's new generation of mecha. However, at this time he did not know that behind the scenes, there was also the participation of the 7 major families of the Federation. He also did not know that on a deeper level, the development of the Federation's new generation of mecha was closely linked to the presidential election of the Federation, and all of this had been coordinated and designed by that Senator Macklin. He did not even know that at this time, there were people in the Capital Special District who were preparing to use violent means to deal with him. Danger was approaching him. All of this was to prevent him from interfering with the other party's acquisition of the data in the laboratory. The black car drove smoothly on the wide road of Huangdu. Occasionally, overly green and succulent green leaves would fall gently onto the top of the car, and then be abruptly bounced off. These green leaves had not reached the end of their lives. Instead, because they were too young and too nourished, they were envied by the heavens. The night was dark. At the entrance of Mountain Tiger Road, Su Li's eyes narrowed. From the car's radar he sensed a few cars approaching at high speed from behind. "Fasten your seatbelt." He spoke softly to Zhou beside him. Today was the day of the routine pregnancy checkup, and they had just left Huangdu Hospital. The rapidly approaching cars behind them might be passing racers or trouble, but Su Li's first concern was Zhou's health. On top of the Mountain Tiger Road, an inconspicuous off-road vehicle was quietly parked at the edge of the cliff. The window was rolled down, and the blonde Park Ji-ho coldly looked at the black car on the road below the mountain, as well as the vehicles behind it that were quickly approaching with dazzling headlights. He had used his own channels to investigate Su Lu. He knew that this person was indeed a guy with no background and only had some luck. Therefore, he increasingly felt that this world was very unfair. In the past few years, he had always been vaguely suppressed by Zhou. He could accept this because Zhou was an A student of the First Military Academy. However, this person called Su Lu, what was he? Why was he able to enter the research institute? Why was he able to impregnate the daughter of the Deputy Minister of National Defense? Why was he so lucky to be able to get acquainted with the young master of the Tai family? Park Ji-ho was a friend of the Li family's 7th young master, Li Xiaotong. Tonight he was working for the Li family's eldest young master, Li Xiuzhu. He was a smart person. He knew why the Li family's eldest young master, who was as beautiful as a monster, chose him. Therefore he was very careful in his work. Tonight they didn't want Su Lu to die. They just wanted him to lie in bed for half a year so that he wouldn't disturb the plans of those big shots. This mission wasn't difficult to complete. The difficult part was that Park Ji-ho didn't want to expose himself to those people. Although he didn't know how powerful Su Li's background was, he still didn't want to face the anger of those people who had nothing to do with him. In fact, this matter didn't require him to do anything. He only found out about Su Li's schedule tonight. Then, through some channels, he told those arrogant and vengeful rich second generations in the capital. Park Ji-ho still remembered how Su Lu humiliated those rich second generations at the entrance of Green Mountain Park that night. With this kind of opportunity, those rich second generations would definitely not let it go. He only needed to calmly watch this scene unfold on the cliff and make sure that Su Lu wouldn't die. He would only be disabled. If anything unexpected happened, he could immediately remedy it. Sensing that there was danger approaching from behind, Su Li's expression didn't change at all. After Zhou fastened her seatbelt, she frowned slightly and looked at him. She didn't understand why he was so calm. The black car didn't speed up. Instead, it slowly slowed down and finally stopped at the entrance of Hushan Road. Su Lu carefully looked at the display of the light dots on the car control computer screen. He looked up, as if he wanted to see something on the mountain through the roof of the car. Accompanied by the ear-piercing sound of the brakes and a slightly burnt smell, 5 or 6 high-class sports cars suddenly stopped and surrounded the black car. The people in the car obviously didn't expect that Su Lu didn't step on the accelerator and leave. Instead, he stopped as if he was waiting for them. Su Lu opened the door, walked out, and locked all the doors of the black car. So you looked at those young people coming out of the expensive sports cars. She couldn't help but feel a chill in her heart. She knew very well that those people were here for revenge. Not only could she tell from their expressions, but also because they all brought their own bodyguards today. In the world of the Federation, money meant everything. No matter what the background of these rich second generations was, their bodyguards were all very powerful people. Looks like I'm lucky today to actually catch you. A young man with a gloomy face and an iron golf club in his hand walked toward Sulu. He stopped about 5 or 6 meters away and said in a cold tone as if he was looking at a dead person, "Don't worry, we know what we're doing. At most we'll break one of your legs." More than a dozen people surrounded Sulu. Obviously, the valiant men walking at the front were all bodyguards. Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked at the crowd around him. He could feel the abilities of those bodyguards. At the same time, a trace of doubt appeared in his heart. These people obviously didn't bump into him. They came prepared. The problem was that he didn't have any deep hatred with them. Who would deliberately target him? Suli's silence seemed a little strange in the eyes of these people. The young leader said with a sullen face, "Don't talk nonsense. Cut his 2 hamstrings. Let's see how he can step on the gas pedal in the future." Sulu had already forgotten what these people looked like, but when he heard this, he remembered that this young man was the owner of the white sports car that he had knocked into the flood ditch that night. A bodyguard slowly pulled out a knife from his waist. The knife was as cold as water in the night, but there was a faint smell of blood. It seemed that he often saw blood. Sulu narrowed his eyes. He knew that he was unarmed. In the eyes of these people, he was like a lamb waiting to be slaughtered. He had never figured out the identity of these young masters, nor did he want to figure it out. However, looking at the people the other party had brought today, they were indeed professionals. Especially that saber 7 sabers. The cold gleam on them did not flash at all, but it made his heart somewhat cold. The Federation strictly controlled firearms. Except for people with deep military backgrounds like the Zhou family siblings, no one dared to casually take out a submachine gun to shoot. Even the Zhou family siblings had to be more careful in a place like the Capital Special District. Whether it was in the underworld or in the court, there was always a need for a good weapon to kill people. And there was no doubt that the 7 knives Sulu was facing were used to cutting people's hamstrings and other cruel things. No one was an immortal. Madman Li was known to be invincible in the army, but that was only in a one-on-one situation. If Madman Li was facing dozens of shining and cold knives, he would probably immediately turn around and run away. But with that person's fierce reputation, probably no one would dare to chase him. Sulu was only facing 7 knives, and he didn't have enough fierce reputation to intimidate the enemy, so he didn't run away. He already felt that some people and some forces had already targeted him. At this time there was no point in running away. Whoosh! A knife chopped down at Suli's face. There was no fancy move, only ruthlessness and proficiency that had been immersed in for many years. At the same time the knife flashed, Sulu had already moved. He knew that tonight was dangerous, so he didn't hold back. The bottom of his military boots on the concrete road was like an emergency brake, and the strong friction with the ground provided a strong support for his speed. With a crisp crack before the knife chopped down, Sulu had already closed in on the bodyguard's arms. He punched the man's armpit, and his right forearm, which was like an iron rod in front of him, actually hit the man's throat. That crisp sound was the sound of the throat cartilage breaking. The bodyguard didn't even make a sound. His body seemed to have been pulled out of his bones, and he softly fell to the ground. The cold knife in his hand had already left his hand and fell to the ground. The faces of the surrounding young masters instantly turned pale. They didn't know that the kid they were going to deal with today was so difficult to deal with. The knife was still falling in the air. Sulu tightly held the handle of the knife. His feet were still firmly planted on the concrete road, and there wasn't a trace of trembling. Only when his feet were firmly planted on the ground could he use the 10 moves he had learned from Uncle Fengyu to show the slyness and ruthlessness of his strength. Sulu believed in his fist, but the knife was always harder than his fist. So he tightly gripped the handle of the knife, lowered his head, and rushed into the snowy light formed by the remaining 6 knives. Rip! The blade cut through his clothes, cut through his flesh, and blood spurted out. Suli's feet firmly planted on the ground, but his upper body was like a willow branch in the wind, randomly swaying and swaying. He displayed the close combat techniques that had been deeply ingrained in his mind to the extreme. In the light of the knives, he narrowly dodged and rushed forward. He had a pair of eyes that were good at capturing all traces. In his body, he had the most tyrannical power of the Federation. He had the most ruthless techniques. Swoosh, 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 the blade light shattered the night sky. It was only a matter of a moment, and the sound of the cold blade cutting through the air suddenly stopped. During this process, the blade that Sulu was holding tightly did not make a single contact with the 6 blades. The 7 bodyguards who used knives all fell into a pool of blood. Some of them had their throats broken, some had their thighs severely slashed, and even more had a miserable cut on their chest and abdomen. Some of these bodyguards used long battle knives, while others used extremely vicious military knives. At this time they all fell to the ground in a mess. Sulu held the long knife and silently stood in front of the black car. The cut on his back began to bleed. Chapter 183. There was a mountain on the outskirts of Wangdu, Tiger Mountain. Tiger Mountain Road led up Tiger Mountain. The mountain road was flat but not straight, steep but not dangerous. Because of this mountain, it was often a nighttime entertainment ground for a group of racers. The roar of motors was common, and danger was everywhere. Therefore, the citizens of Wangdu usually hid here. Probably only foreigners like Sulu, who had just settled down not long ago, would choose to pass through this road. The mountain road extended upward from the entrance, like the chocolate lace on the edge of a cake, circling around. From the very beginning, Park Ji-ho had been standing at the edge of the mountain road on the 2nd level. His gaze passed through the trees on the cliff below and watched the conflict at the entrance. The power behind him had many ways to deal with Sulu, but the methods on the surface were too slow. They couldn't wait any longer, so they chose the most direct method. But he didn't want Sulu to die. On the one hand, it was for his own benefit. He could forcefully suppress his jealousy. On the other hand, it was because of the orders of the young master from the Lee family. He believed that the young masters who had caught wind of the news would be very careful. After all, under the glory of the first charter, if there was a vicious death in the capital, their parents wouldn't be able to clean up the mess. It would probably be a broken leg and lying in the hospital for a few months. Park Ji-ho rubbed his slightly messy blonde hair and thought about this in the night wind. There wasn't a trace of sympathy on his face, only indifference. That guy called Sulu lying in the hospital for a few months couldn't affect the plan that he didn't really understand. That slightly messy blonde hair, in the night wind, looked like flowers that bloomed randomly in the mountains in late spring. The car had already turned off, so he believed that the people below wouldn't notice him. In the gentle late spring night wind, Park Ji-ho calmly watched the good show at the bottom of the cliff. He was very gratified by the preparation of those young masters. At this time, he believed in young Master Lee's judgment. How could there be a young man in the Federation who was on the same level as Madman Lee? However, the moment the blade flashed, the expression on his face suddenly changed. He watched in shock as Sulu knocked down a bodyguard like a thunderbolt. Park Ji-ho was well aware that although those young masters were good for nothings, the bodyguards that their families hired with a large amount of money were the real experts. During their interactions a few days ago, Li Qixiao's sharp eyes had pointed out that these bodyguards should be retired Special Forces soldiers from the military. But why was that bodyguard, who looked ruthless and tyrannical, not a match for Sulu? Half of Park Ji-ho's heart turned cold. The saber light at the bottom of the cliff rose and fell. Everything returned to normal. Park Ji-ho had a vague feeling that the young second lieutenant had subconsciously raised his head to look at him. That pair of eyes were as cold and sharp as knives. Park Ji-ho shuddered slightly and stopped watching the battle. He turned around and walked towards his car. It would be very dangerous to stay here any longer. The bodyguards of these young masters were all experts. Although they used knives of different sizes and styles, there was a ruthlessness in their bones that showed that they didn't take human life seriously. In the chaotic battle, Suli's back was slashed by a sinister military knife. The dark blue military uniform was torn apart, and the skin on his back was torn open. His flesh and blood were turned over, and blood began to seep out. Although the injury wasn't serious, it looked particularly terrifying. Until now, His feet had been steadily stepping on the concrete floor, and only moved on a flat surface. Like the deep roots of an old tree, he channeled all his strength into his body, making each of his attacks more powerful and accurate than before. With a crisp sound of breaking branches, Sulu stepped on the wrist of a bodyguard and directly broke his wrist. The bodyguard was cut in the leg and fell into a pool of blood, but he still didn't give up. However, Sulu didn't give him any chance to sneak attack. At the same time he lifted his leg, the knife in Sulu's hand swung out like a whip, hitting the face of the young master closest to him with unstoppable force. He used the back of the knife, and with one strike, half of the young master's face was cut open. A few teeth and blood spurted out. That arrogant and gloomy face at the beginning was now only filled with fear, pain, and confusion. The confusion was because these young people in the Federation were used to being arrogant. For a moment, they didn't understand how the scene in front of them happened. Why did their bodyguards, who were so good at fighting, fall into a pool of blood one by one? Get lost. In the darkness at the entrance of Tiger Mountain Road, the young second lieutenant held the saber in his hand. Blood dripped from the edge of the saber. He, who had been silent since he was stopped by the motorcade, finally opened his mouth and said the first word. These young masters were not idiots. The miserable cuts on the bodyguards' bodies had already explained too much. They reacted extremely quickly. Knowing that they had made a big mistake tonight, they did not leave any words to save their faces. They quickly helped the bodyguards on the ground up and returned to their sports cars. The Federation society was like this. The difference in strength was too big, and it was useless to say anything. These young people didn't abandon the bodyguards in the end, which was already considered to be relatively calm. However, their pale faces and slightly trembling bodies exposed their true emotions under Sulu's saber. Sulu didn't pay attention to these people anymore. Although his back was burning with pain, he knew that these people were just knives used by others. The real character was still hiding behind. No hiding above. He turned around and raised his head to take a look at the night sky above the cliff. When they stopped earlier, the radar and computer analysis in the black car had already shown on the holographic screen that there was a car above the mountain road. Until now the car hadn't left. It was very clear that the owner of the car had been watching this scene with cold eyes. Sulu took off his clothes. The torn clothes on his back rubbed against the flesh and blood. It was very painful. His eyebrows furrowed. However, he found that Zhou Yu in the black car was looking at him in a daze. He threw the military uniform over and blocked the window of the black car. He didn't want a pregnant woman to see the blood on the concrete floor and the remnants of the flesh and blood. While the military uniform was still floating in the air, Sulu had already rushed toward the cliff. That familiar burning sensation had been circulating in his limbs for a long time. The powerful explosive force made him suddenly move so shockingly fast. He actually brought up a trail of dust on the concrete floor. Zhou Yu turned her head in shock and looked at Sulu, who was wearing a white singlet. Sulu was like a ferocious beast. With a whoosh he passed through the green space beside the road and plunged into the bushes on the cliff of Tiger Mountain. Vaguely one could see the shrubs on the cliff shake. A shadow shook the soil and rushed up the cliff in a straight line at an extremely fast speed. It was so fast that it was hard to imagine. Zhou Yu put both hands on the window. Her eyes were wide open as she stared at this scene in a daze. She grew up in the courtyard of the 3rd Military Region's General Assembly base. In this life she had seen more soldiers than the average Federation citizen on TV. She also knew that the federal military had some terrifyingly capable vanguard soldiers. She had even seen them train with her own eyes. However, she had never imagined that in this world, there would be someone who could see a cliff as flat ground. Like a nimble beast, he would bravely rush up at high speed. After living with Sulu for so long, Zhou Yu believed that she understood this person very well. She also clearly determined that this young man would definitely make many people in the Federation sit up and take notice of him in the future. However, she never would have thought that the battle strength Sulu displayed tonight would be so powerful. The details of the Linhai State Gymnasium incident had been carefully sealed. Zhou Yu finally understood why her brother Prince said that Sulu had saved her life. When he was in the Donglin district, under the protection of the glory of the Charter, the electronic wall that stretched for who knew how many kilometers was only a slightly more difficult obstacle in Sulu's eyes. Not to mention this cliff in front of him that, although the slope was steep, he could still land his feet on it. Sulu landed on the hillside. Every step he took on the stone was exceptionally stable. This was because stability ensured speed and accuracy. Every step he took was very powerful. However, the recoil from every step he took with the cliff made the wound on his back more painful. The more pain he felt, the angrier he became. However, the calmer his heart was, the calmer his expression was. He had fled from the Donglin district to the capital ring. He had left his home and forgotten his past. His girlfriend had turned into a firework. His good friend had fled thousands of miles away, leaving behind a pregnant woman. All of these sad memories and the depression that had accumulated over the past 2 years finally turned into anger and explosive desire under the stimulation of the pain of his wound. He considered himself to be a very peaceful person. However, there were so many unfairness in the Federation that he could not get rid of it like the air around him. Professor Shin was dead. Those high and mighty dazzling big shots wanted to seize what did not belong to them. Tonight, there were even people who wanted to set up a trap to kill him. Until today, Sulu still thought that he was just a small character in the Federation. However, once a small character was enraged, they were still very scary. There was a proverb in the Federation. Once an ordinary man is angry, even the king will bleed. Today, the most powerful person in the Federation happened to be called an ordinary man. A few sharp thorns from the shrubs pierced into his exposed arms. Suli's expression did not change in the slightest. He stepped onto the road above the cliff and directly rushed toward the off-road vehicle that was about to start the engine. The power in his body burst out in an instant. Every pair of muscle fibers in his legs began to squeeze and twist. A moment later, he rushed to the side of the off-road vehicle. Without saying anything, he stabbed the tip of the knife diagonally downwards. A series of screeching sounds that made one's teeth ache resounded throughout the quiet Tiger Mountain road amidst the sparks of metal grinding against metal. The long knife in Suli's hand accurately stabbed into the door right before it closed. The door and the knife rubbed against each other and vibrated. In the end, the door did not close and instead bounced open. The silent Sulu did not say anything. He stabbed the tip of the knife into the spot beside the driver's seat of the off-road vehicle. The tip of the knife broke through the high-energy plastic and pierced through the complicated circuits. Accompanied by tiny electric sparks, he successfully destroyed the ignition system of the off-road vehicle. He was a genius mechanic. In the Donglin district's Shanglan Avenue repair shop, he had once repaired cars. Today, he could even deal with mechas, not to mention a simple off-road vehicle. With the ignition circuit destroyed, this off-road vehicle could no longer escape. Sitting in the driver's seat, Park Ji-ho stared blankly at the cold blade that was less than 10 centimeters away from his thigh. His left hand that was holding the steering wheel and his right hand that was holding the key to start the engine began to tremble uncontrollably. Chapter 184. Park Ji-ho didn't want to admit that he was in fear. He had always thought of himself as the best of the younger generation in the Federation. He was an outstanding student from the 3 major military academies. He entered the Shell Motor Corporation Engineering Department and was about to enter the Federal Academy of Science. He might even become Dean Lin's student. His life experience and achievements were enough to provide him with a strong sense of self-confidence. He was a young officer. Regardless of whether it was close combat or mecha combat, he was an extremely strong character. No matter how one looked at it, although the off-road vehicle couldn't move, he shouldn't be afraid. However, his slightly trembling hands made Park Ji-ho realize that he had developed a natural fear of the person beside him. Previously, when he stood on the cliff and looked down, he saw the snow-like gleam of the blade and the splash of blood. Suli's strong strength, especially his calmness during the bloody battle, left a deep impression on Park Ji-ho. He even felt danger, which was why he chose to leave immediately. However, the opponent found him in such a short time and used a blade to cut off all his escape routes. Park Ji-ho felt a deep chill. Especially when he thought of the rumor that night at the Linyuan restaurant, even Madman Lee couldn't beat this person. His 2 hands trembled even more violently. The 2 moons in the sky were all behind the clouds. Tiger Mountain Road was dark. Only the lights at the bottom of the cliff faintly illuminated the peace of the Wan family. The car door creaked. Park Ji-ho walked out of the off-road vehicle. He lowered his head and looked at the blade tightly held in Su Li's hand. He looked at the blood that was gradually turning into a thick paste on the blade. He took a deep breath and forced himself to calm down. How did you get yourself into such a mess? A smart person would know that in this situation, there was no point in saying such things, especially when Park Ji-ho's face was pale. However, Park Ji-ho still said it because he had to take a gamble. He had to see if this young soldier named Su Lu in front of him had the guts to do it. Who sent you? Su Lu looked at Park Ji-ho's blonde hair and lowered his head slightly. His grip on the hilt of his sword tightened. When he saw Park Ji-ho, he should be able to guess the power behind him. A smart person wouldn't ask too much, but he still did. Park Ji-ho smiled bitterly and said, "It's meaningless to ask these questions. Just now on the road, you didn't even kill those people who wanted to kill you. Naturally, you won't kill me. Since you won't kill me, I won't tell you anything. I just want to remind you that in front of a truly powerful force, you are just a small fry. No matter how good you are at fighting, as long as they say the word, you will be beaten into a hornet's nest." Su Li's expression did not change at all. His head was still slightly lowered. After a while he said, "I've always wanted to be a law-abiding citizen, but unfortunately, the Federation did not give me this opportunity. When I was in my teens, I had already killed someone." When he said this, his tone was very calm and unhurried. It was as if he was telling Park Ji-ho how to solve the spring recruitment exam questions. However, it was this calm tone that made Park Ji-ho's face, which had just improved a little, turn even paler. "I was wrong." Park Ji-ho smiled bitterly and said, "I was really wrong. I shouldn't have turned off the engine. At least I shouldn't have pulled out the key." This was a sincere sentence, but it was a fatal mistake. Since he was using someone else to kill, there was no reason for him to appear at the scene. Park Ji-ho's mistake was that he thought he was careful enough hiding on the mountain road. He didn't expect Su Lu to be able to find him in such a short time and cut off his escape route. At this moment, he vaguely understood that the reason he insisted on standing on the cliff of Husan Mountain Road and watching this scene unfold was not to deal with an emergency. It was just that he subconsciously still couldn't forget the scene in the spring recruitment exam in nutshell. He wanted to see Su Lu, this lucky soldier, with his own eyes. He wanted to see with his own eyes Su Lu, this lucky soldier, break his leg and roll on the concrete road in pain. Li Xiuzhu also made a mistake. He thought he had overestimated Su Lu, but he still underestimated him. Of the 7 big families in the Federation, the Li family was known for its meticulous planning. However, in the eyes of the Li family's legitimate successor, Su Lu, a small figure, was not a guy that could be deduced with common sense. Su Lu was an anomaly that broke into the upper circle of the Federation. He was as hard and stubborn as a rock. His strength did not lie in the Tai family, nor did it lie in the son-in-law of the Minister of National Defense. It lay in the knowledge in his mind and the strength in his body. The pale-faced Park Ji-ho muttered to himself that he was wrong. However, his slightly lowered eyes became calmer and calmer. He didn't know if Su Lu in front of him would suddenly make a move, but he knew that if he really dared to say anything, what awaited him in the future would still be a dead end. His hands trembled at his sides as if out of fear. However, in reality, he knew that he was only trying to make his hands appear more natural. There was still a few centimeters of distance between him and the pistol at his waist. With his fastest draw speed and shooting results in the military academy, Su Lu in front of him, even if he really had the terrifying strength of Madman Li, only death would await him. Su Li's head was also slightly lowered. He didn't notice the hidden changes in Park Ji-ho's eyes. He also didn't notice that Park Ji-ho's expression had gradually calmed down. This was because in the mine in the Donglin district, Uncle Feng Yu had reminded him more than once that in this kind of situation, he only needed to stare at the opponent's hands. Park Ji-ho's trembling hands suddenly moved. He leaned to the side like lightning and pulled out the pistol he always carried with him. Su Lu also moved. The long knife in his right hand chopped down, and the light of the knife lit up. This was a good sharp knife. Park Ji-ho's right hand, accompanied by a spurt of blood, separated from his wrist. It fell to the concrete floor together with the pistol that glowed with a metallic luster. This outstanding officer of the new generation of the Federation with a bright future, quietly looked at his wrist that was as neat as a broken branch. He looked at the gurgling blood on it. He looked at the dazzling white bone and the threads of flesh on his broken wrist. His brows furrowed. Park Ji-ho didn't understand why Su Li's knife was so fast. Why did he dare to swing it over so unreasonably? Could it be that from the very beginning, the opponent had already made up his mind to kill him? At this moment he didn't think that he was the one who wanted to pull out his gun and kill Su Lu. It was only at this moment that the clear and maddening pain from his broken wrist transmitted into his brain. It made him feel so much pain that he wanted to die. He wanted to howl in grief. However, he couldn't howl in pain because a thin line of blood appeared on his neck. The blood began to seep down from the line. It looked like a white can of ketchup that had been cut by a knife. Park Ji-ho turned his head painfully and stared at Su Li's face in disbelief. Until the moment of his death, he still felt that this matter was ridiculous. How could a person like him, who was destined to be famous in the Federation, die so early? How could he die so quietly on Hushan Road? When he turned his head, the blood in the line on his neck flowed even faster. He used his left hand and his right hand, which only had one wrist left, to cover his throat. However, he couldn't stop his life from flowing away with the blood. He fell to the ground with a thud. He twitched a few times and then stopped moving. Su Lu looked at Park Ji-ho's body on the ground. He felt a little strange. He wasn't a master of swords. The previous chop was just a subconscious reaction under the dangerous situation. The blade was aimed at his wrist. He didn't expect the blade to be slightly deformed when it was clipped by the door of the off-road vehicle. The sharp tip of the blade actually swept past his neck. This wasn't the first time he killed someone. When he killed someone for the first time, he was still very young. That night, it was raining heavily in the garbage dump behind Bell Tower Street. The sharp hydraulic pipe was so light in his hand. In the underground parking lot of Linhai Gymnasium, Su Lu had also killed several people, but that was in the middle of a battle after all. Today he had only met Park Ji-ho a few times, but he had clearly seen him die in front of him. Su Lu always thought of himself as a good person. He also wanted to be a good person. However, would a good person kill someone? This was a philosophical question. He didn't want to think about it. He looked at Park Ji-ho's body on the ground. He didn't want to vomit or blame himself. He just felt a little confused. However, the confusion only lasted for 3 seconds. He turned around and walked down the cliff. "Fasten your seatbelt," Su Lu whispered to Zhou in the passenger seat. He had already taken off his blood-stained vest. He found a spare shirt in the trunk and put it on. However, the faint smell of blood was still so pungent in the enclosed space of the car. Zhou looked at him quietly. Her hands carefully covered her swollen abdomen. Her face was pale but her eyes were bright. She didn't know what Su Lu did when he rushed up the cliff. However, looking at Su Li's calm expression and the ominous smell of blood, she could vaguely guess. This was a mysterious guy. "I'll take you home." The black car quickly left Hushan Road. It didn't drive to the simple apartment they had lived in for a long time. Instead, it turned around and headed to the Capital Special District at the end of Highway 2. "What happened?" Zhou lowered her eyes and asked softly. "I killed a person. Maybe in a while I will be wanted by the Federation." Su Lu looked at the flashing signs on the highway in front of the car window. After a moment of silence he said, "Park Ji-ho, the person Li Xiaotong took with you when you raced last time, it has something to do with me?" After Zhou became pregnant, she became much gentler. In particular, her pair of black eyes always flashed with a sentimental light. However, she was a cold girl who liked to wear red. After hearing that Su Lu killed someone, the shock in her eyes disappeared. She calmly cared about the truth behind the matter. "No, it should be related to the data in the laboratory. Those people wanted to steal Professor Shin's data, but I was in the middle." Su Lu slightly turned the steering wheel in his hand. Following the signs on the highway, he drove in the direction of the Ministry of National Defense's apartment in the Capital Special District. After a moment of silence he continued, "I have to do something tonight and I think it will be difficult to accompany you to protect the baby in the future. So I have to take you home first. I hope you won't be angry." It was rare to hear Su Lu joke about protecting the baby in his sentence. Zhou's expression didn't change at all. She looked at Su Li's side profile with a dignified expression and asked, "What do you want to do? Where does Li Xiaotong usually go at night?" After hearing this, Zhou Yu's eyebrows instantly furrowed tightly. Her hands nervously covered her abdomen. She sighed and said, "My stomach is a little uncomfortable. Accompany me to the hospital first." Chapter 185. The harsh and seductive Zhou Yu, the quiet and peaceful Zhou Yu, the red windbreaker wearing Zhou Yu, the cute maternity dress wearing Zhou Yu. They were all Zhou Yu. After hearing Zhou Yu's somewhat abrupt request, Su Lu fell silent. He was not stunned by the silence, but instead, the corners of his mouth drew back, revealing his neat white teeth as he laughed heartily. To a Donglin orphan like Su Lu, the Federation was a cold world filled with the smell of money and the smell of metal and machinery. However, it was always good to have someone concerned about his life and death. Zhou Yu had subconsciously said this because she was worried about Su Lu. Su Lu understood this concern and shook off his previous gloominess. He said very seriously, "Thank you." Other than thank you, Su Lu did not say anything else in response to the concern of the eldest daughter of the Zhou family. He stared unblinkingly at the road in front of the car that stretched endlessly in the dark night. His calm expression revealed a sense of determination. The silence in the car lasted for a long time. Zhou Yu's eyelids were lowered slightly, her eyelashes resting lightly on her fair skin. She knew that although this fellow beside her looked quiet and optimistic, in reality, there was always a stubbornness in his bones that no one could understand. As long as he had decided on something, there was probably no one in this world who could stop him. The Zhou Yu of the past would definitely not have cared about Su Li's life and death. To the her of that time, Su Lu was a completely insignificant character in another world. However, after dozens of days and nights in the Wangdu apartment, even two stray cats in a junkyard might have developed some feelings of mutual support, let alone two real people. Thus, Zhou Yu decided to help Su Lu analyze some things and see if she could help him. "We need to understand why the Li family would think of dealing with you to ensure the flow of the laboratory data. The development of the new generation of mecha is definitely a top priority for the federal military right now, but the Iron Calculator is a financial magnate of the Federation. It is impossible for him to suddenly switch over to the field of technology." Her gaze slowly turned to Qingqiu, who was passing by quickly at the side of the window. She said, "In the eyes of those people, you are just a nobody. There is no reason for them to do anything to you. Unless the Li family misjudged my relationship with you and were worried that you would hand over the data from the laboratory to my father, or the Tai family." Seeing that Su Lu didn't answer, Zhou Yu was silent for a moment before she suddenly said, "The Li family has always been secretly supporting Jingzhou's Governor Ross and Senator Macklin. It just so happens that they are at odds with the Tai family. I think this matter shouldn't be that simple." Su Lu narrowed his eyes slightly. The smell of blood on his body had been diluted by the automatic air conditioning device in the black car, but at this moment it seemed to have thickened a little. "In the past, our analysis should have been that the Federal Academy of Science wanted to take the credit for the development of the new generation of mecha. Now there is another Li family." So you didn't sense the change in Su Li's mood. She frowned slightly and said, "In the presidential election, Dean Lin is indeed a variable." If Su Lu knew that Zhou Yu's analysis of the current situation was so close to the truth, he would definitely be very impressed by this young unmarried mother's political sense. Since the beginning of puberty, the woman that the madam of the Tai family had nurtured with countless afternoon tea sessions. Under that arrogant and cold face, bits and pieces of wisdom regarding politics would always gather together and become some kind of asset. However, at this moment, Su Lu no longer cared about the political strife and schemes of so many of the Federation's upper echelons. He was a small fry, so he had his own way of doing things. So, he only suddenly opened his mouth and asked again, "At night, where does Li Xiaotong usually stay?" Seeing that Su Lu didn't seem to care much about her analysis, a trace of displeasure flashed through Zhou Yu's eyes. She said calmly, "If the laboratory data you want to take back is really related to the presidential election, I advise you to let go. The Federal Academy of Science and Li family. This is the perfect combination of knowledge hegemony and the magic of money. And if it is as I have guessed and it is related to the presidential election," she looked at him coldly, You are like a toad blocking the highway. You won't be of any use at all. Besides, what's the point of you looking for Li Xiaotong? She sighed softly. Speaking from the bottom of her heart, she had long developed feelings of admiration towards Su Li's calm and sincere personality that hid an infinite amount of ruthlessness. However, the Federation only cared about strength. Money, status, power, and even influence in the military were all real strength, but they never included personal martial strength. Unless that person's personal strength was like that of the military god from the Lees of Philadelphia, who was above all rules. No matter how good Su Lu was at fighting at the current stage, he was still countless galaxies away from the high and mighty 7 great families and the colossal Federal Academy of Science. Even Lady Tai will remain silent on this matter. First of all, you are not a member of the Tai family. Second of all, this is the Li family's plan. She may be able to sense the enormous benefits involved, but she won't so easily make a decision that will destroy the other party's plan. The 7 great families of the Federation have coexisted for tens of thousands of years. They don't rely on annual wars, but rather on mutual compromise and coexistence. In the end, they are people of the same world. Although they may choose different partners in the political world, they won't easily start a war because of these differences. The 7 great families of the Federation have at least had a few hundred years of peace. It is not uncommon for them to marry each other. You are Sulu. You are an insignificant person. Your surname is not Zhong. Nor is your surname Lin. Nor is your surname Si. How can you possibly contend against the Li family? If you are really my man, perhaps this matter can still be turned around. I don't mean that you might be able to steal back the data in the laboratory, but I mean that you won't be dragged into prison because of this matter. So you didn't hold anything back anymore. She directly analyzed all the possibilities for him to hear. Sulu listened silently, but his expression didn't change at all. His small eyes narrowed slightly, and he said slowly, "When I first started working in Old Shen's laboratory, I once told myself that I might have met a strange person. I even thought very self-deprecatingly that it couldn't be that this strange person would really take me as his last disciple and pass down all his legacy to me. What I didn't expect was that Professor Shen really did leave that laboratory to me in his will. Leaving aside the use of the data in the laboratory for the Federation's first-generation mecha, to be able to ensure that after Professor Shen's death, the normal citizens of the Federation will forever remember him." Su Li's eyes narrowed even more. He said, "Even if there were only a few pieces of paper in that laboratory, I wouldn't let anyone snatch those pieces of paper away." So you was silent. She understood Su Li's meaning. It was just like the famous saying from the distant imperial dynasty tens of thousands of years ago, "The monarch treats me like a country scholar, so I return the favor like a country scholar." This saying was actually not very accurate to describe Su Li's current mood, but there wasn't much of a difference in his emotions. Towards the old man's unwarranted trust and great trust, other than unhesitatingly persevering, there was no other way. The 7 great families of the Federation and those politicians could play politics, compromise, or give in to each other. They would give you some leeway here and seek tacit benefits elsewhere. These were all methods. However, Sulu didn't have the qualifications to play these games, nor did he have such thoughts. He had no way out, so he could only continue forward. The black car stopped at the side gate of the West Mountain compound of the Ministry of Defense. In the shadows, fully armed soldiers were standing guard, but no one cast a glance at the car. Zoe put down the phone, turned her head, and looked deeply at Sulu. She said, "When an ordinary man is angry, he has to have a reason to be angry and know when to advance and when to retreat. Although Park Ji-ho is one of his people, this matter isn't necessarily his doing." Sulu was enlightened. He lowered his head and said, "Understood. Don't worry." Zoe sighed. She vaguely saw a figure walking out of the West Mountain compound. She knew she couldn't stay here any longer. She softly said an address, then looked seriously at Sulu and said, "You have to remember my due date is still a few months away. Since you promised to take care of me, you have to come back safely." Sulu smiled and didn't say anything. However, in his heart, there was a hint of sadness that he hadn't felt for a long time. If he really had a direct confrontation with the Federal Academy of Science and the Li family, how could he, who had just killed someone, return to that simple apartment in Wangdu? The black car left the West Mountain compound of the Ministry of Defense, and drove towards the address that Zhou Yu mentioned. He saw from the rear-view screen that Zhou Yu had already been picked up by a middle-aged woman and Zhou Yu. He was relieved. Driving between the sometimes quiet and sometimes bustling buildings of the capital special district, Sulu thought for a moment, then used the car phone to dial a number. A moment later, he heard Butler Jin's slightly hoarse voice. Taizion said that if I run into any trouble I can call you. Su Li's right hand held the streamlined microphone. He was a sincere and down-to-earth young man, but that didn't mean he was a pedantic guy. Back at the capital spaceport, Madame Zhong's business card was still in his pocket. This fully showed that at certain moments he was willing to lower his head and seek the help of these truly important people. At a critical moment, to blindly brag about one's loftiness and not ask for external help, fighting with one's saber. That was stupidity, not an outstanding quality. However, listening to Butler Jin's slightly bland reply, which was very much like the sound of fruit juice mixed with it, Su Li's expression gradually became serious, and the microphone beside his cheek seemed to become cold. Should he report to Lady Tai tomorrow? Su Lu didn't hide anything during the phone conversation. He directly told Butler Jin about Zhou Yu's speculation, and the importance of the laboratory data that he wanted to protect. However, Butler Jin continued to reply calmly. The 7 major families of the Federation were involved in the interests that the Iron Scheming family wanted. Butler Jin naturally couldn't promise Sulu a single word. This was something that Sulu could think of. However, Butler Jin's tone made him narrow his eyes. It's too late tomorrow. Although the director of the 3rd department said that the laboratory would only be sealed the day after tomorrow, Sulu knew that once the news of Park Ji-ho's death spread, it would be very difficult for him to enter the research institute again. Furthermore, the other party would definitely speed up the pace of seizing the laboratory data. If nothing unexpected happened, the technical director of the research institute, who obviously had a background in the Academy of Science, would directly take over Professor Shun's laboratory with the written order of the board of directors tomorrow morning and remove all the data related to quantum measurability. Although this clearly violated the agreement signed between Professor Shen and the Research Institute back then, and it also conflicted with the copy of Professor Shun's will that Sulu currently had. However, in the face of pressure from the Federal Academy of Science, Sulu simply couldn't find any way to stop all of this. A strong sense of disappointment and helplessness filled Su Li's mind. He leaned against the car door and took a deep breath of the 377 brand cigarette. He didn't wake up until the cigarette tip warmed his nails. He looked at the quiet and noble garden building not far from his feet, licked his lips, and pulled out the bright long knife from the car window beside him. The 7th young master of the Li family, Li Xiaotong, Park Ji-ho's master, should be in this garden building, which was called the Ivy Garden by the citizens of the capital. In the southeast corner of the Ivy Garden, there was a man-made stream that flowed for many years. Decayed soil fell to the bottom of the stream, and old trees stretched their roots out of the embankment. In the spring, flowers and trees were densely planted on the embankment. 2 bright round moons peeked out of the clouds and gently shone on the treetops. Behind this beautiful scenery there was a single building. The appearance of the building was not very eye-catching, but the ancient style of the hooked eaves, although it didn't show the temperament of the owner of the building, at least it showed the owner's economic strength. This was the best and most remote location in the Ivy Garden. The rich people who lived in the front didn't know who this building belonged to. The 7 families of the Federation lived in the Federation, but they were like the shadows of the clouds, not easily showing their true faces. There were flowers under the window, flowers on the window, flowers on the bed curtains, and 2 conspicuous red flowers on the naked woman's jade-like body on the bed. The 7th young master of the Li family, Li Xiaotong, got up from the woman's body in satisfaction. He lightly patted the woman's plump buttocks, chuckled, and rushed her to take a bath. He put on a dark-colored pajamas and went to the window. He looked at the flowers above and below the window, slightly lost in thought. He was a person who cherished flowers, but there were too many flowers around him, so he naturally became a playboy. It was only a few months ago, when he had some thoughts about the daughter of the Zhou family, that he restrained himself a little. But he didn't expect that the eldest daughter, who was used to using arrogance to cover up her loneliness, was actually pregnant. Li Xiaotong returned to his original playboy life. This afternoon, Li Xiaotong had found a piece of information that made him angry, so he was not in a good mood. Although he was still gentle and decent in front of that woman, once the pleasure was over, he felt a little lonely and sad. He was the seventh young master of the Li family, but in front of that beautiful man, he didn't have any glory. That person didn't even need to fight, and the people he liked would abandon him one after another and throw themselves into the arms of that person, because that person was the true successor of the Li family. The moment he thought of this, the dark and ruthless look in his deep facial features and dark and calm eyes suddenly became a bit thicker. He was originally an extremely outstanding person. Casually standing among the flowers, he was like an untamed plum, disdaining to move no matter how the snow clouds moved in the sky and the snowstorm hit his body. It was also because of this coldness that occasionally leaked out that he was evaluated as having a sinister temperament in his family. Just that he looked a bit sinister, but what did that have to do with his temperament? Li Xiaotong frowned and thought, then laughed self-deprecatingly. Since he was evaluated as having a sinister temperament, then he deliberately acted more sinister these past few years. In any case, he couldn't win against that person, so there was no need to fight. At the age of 16, he was selected as the second successor of the Li family. At that time, Li Xiaotong was so well regarded, but after being suppressed for so many years, he knew that he wasn't that person's opponent, so he simply gave up. With the Li family's inexhaustible wealth, he wandered around the nightclubs of the major planets of the Federation, driving that silver wraith, lonely and lonely. Li Xiaotong silently sat on the sofa by the window, slightly raising his head, looking at the bright moon outside the window and the short flowers and trees on the windowsill. After that woman finished bathing, she would leave and never come back to this room. This was his rule. A gust of night wind blew in, and the thick cyan curtain by the window moved slightly. Li Xiaotong's pupils slightly shrank, and his hand subconsciously reached back, but immediately stopped. The tip of a knife that reflected the white moonlight appeared in the cyan curtain. At this moment the knife's light was so dazzling. Almost at the same time, the door of the room silently opened, and a man in dark clothes aimed a pistol behind the curtain. The black metal barrel of the gun was so cold at this moment. Seeing that man's arrival, Li Xiaotong's narrowed pupils gradually relaxed, but he still didn't move at all, quietly looking at the tip of the knife. Since the man with the gun didn't shoot directly, it meant that he thought that the person behind the curtain with the knife could hurt him even if he was shot. Li Xiaotong's greatest strength was that he never underestimated anyone, and he trusted the judgment of a professional. So he didn't move at all. After staying on the mountain behind the ivy garden for a long time, Sulu finally found a chance to approach this independent building. With the amazing strength trained by Uncle Fengyu, he wouldn't be afraid even when facing the special elite of the military, but it was so difficult to quietly break through those defenses. He finally understood that the 7 great families of the Federation were not ordinary forces, and even a second-generation figure like Li Xiaotong had such a strong security force around him. While Li Xiaotong was enjoying the pleasure of a man and a woman, Sulu secretly sneaked into the room. At this time the bodyguard shouldn't be in the room, so this was the best opportunity. However, what shocked Sulu was that before he could do anything, the bodyguard in dark clothes quietly opened the door and pointed a gun at him. A trace of dangerous aura filled the entire room. Sulu slowly walked out from behind the blue curtains. He didn't look at the 7th young master of the Li family who was sitting on the sofa next to him. Instead, he narrowed his eyes and looked at the middle-aged bodyguard with a gun at the door. Even if the middle-aged bodyguard didn't have a gun in his hand, he was still an extremely dangerous person. Suli's eyes narrowed even more. Previously, he didn't hear any footsteps outside the door, and he didn't even hear any breathing. How did this person appear? How could he be so powerful? The middle-aged bodyguard in dark clothes was also quietly looking at Sulu. His right shoulder was slightly drooping, and his muscles were extremely relaxed. The special pistol in his hand moved precisely with Suli's every step. As long as he wanted to, he could pull the trigger at any time and kill Sulu. However, he didn't because Suli's left hand was protecting the upper half of his face. This posture looked a bit wretched, and it was obviously impossible to block a bullet with one arm. However, the middle-aged bodyguard's expression gradually became dignified. In fact, apart from the Tai and Zhong families, the 7 families of the Federation didn't really worry about the safety of their descendants. This was because those families had many children. Since it was impossible for the enemy forces to use this method to deal a fatal blow to these families, they naturally didn't want to use this kind of iron-blooded method to attract the endless revenge of these families. Even so, there would still be people responsible for the safety of these second-generation children of the 7 families. This was especially true for second-generation heirs like Li Xiaotong. Whether he was willing or not, there would be an extremely terrifying expert protecting him on his left and right. At this time, the middle-aged bodyguard who forced Su Lu into a desperate situation was precisely such a person. This middle-aged bodyguard's face was ordinary, but his body under his clothes was like a gun that could break free at any time and cut through everything in front of him, directly taking the enemy's life. Su Lu felt this kind of threat, so he didn't dare to move lightly. In the past few days, the most powerful people Su Lu had seen should be that fatty Captain Tian and Madman Li. A monster like Uncle Feng Yu was naturally excluded. However, perhaps because the situation was different, neither Captain Tian nor Madman Li gave Su Lu a stronger sense of danger than this middle-aged bodyguard at this time. The Federation was indeed full of hidden dragons and crouching tigers. Existences like the 7 great families were indeed not something that could be challenged by mere brute courage. Just as Su Lu felt a faint sense of regret, he didn't know that Li Xiaotong and the middle-aged bodyguard who had been silent all this time became even more vigilant after seeing his face clearly. A person who could quietly sneak into the bedroom of the 7th young master of the Li family and use only a long knife in his hand to make the middle-aged bodyguard not dare to move lightly was really rare in the Federation. There were rumors that after I left Linyuan that day, you and Madman Li fought to a draw. I always thought that it was an exaggeration. My big brother thinks that Madman Li deliberately gave you a chance to become famous because of that Crown Prince and Miso family. In the tense silence, the 7th young master of the Li family, Li Xiaotong, suddenly looked at Su Li's face and laughed. He lightly clapped his hands and said, "Only today did I know that the rumors were true." His expression suddenly calmed down, and a trace of sternness flashed through his gloomy eyes. He slowly said, "Even Madman Li can't quietly approach my bed. I'm really curious, Su Lu, how did you do it?" Su Lu had his own secrets. In the capital ring, he dared to fight against the forces that had been passed down for thousands of years in the Federation. The skills that Uncle Feng Yu had left for him naturally had a channel to use. At this time he naturally couldn't explain anything to Li Xiaotong. When he heard Li Xiaotong call out the intruder's name, the middle-aged bodyguard's expression became even colder. Since the intruder knew Li Xiaotong and dared to come in without hiding, he naturally had the intention to fight to the death. It wouldn't matter if it was a normal person, but the middle-aged bodyguard clearly knew that the ordinary-looking young man holding a knife behind the curtain was definitely not a normal person. He took a few steps forward. Su Li's eyes narrowed. He noticed that the man's shoulders and arms didn't tremble at all when he took a step forward. The gun muzzle was terrifyingly steady. He couldn't let this person come any closer. When he was within 5 steps, even if he died, he wouldn't be able to threaten Li Xiaotong's life. To Su Li's surprise, Li Xiaotong smiled and said to the middle-aged bodyguard, "Brother Zeng, don't be too nervous. Su Lu is my friend." Su Lu and Li Xiaotong had only met once and a half. Naturally, they weren't friends. He didn't quite understand the deeper meaning of this sentence. "You want to kill me?" Li Xiaotong was still sitting on the sofa, and his gloomy face gradually relaxed. "I'm not a normal person. If you kill me, the Bureau of Proclamation will definitely put you on the wanted list. Whether you can escape or not, your life will be ruined." At this time, Su Lu said the first sentence after entering the room, "I've already killed Park Ji-ho." Hearing this, Li Xiaotong didn't look nervous or angry at all. After being slightly startled, he laughed. His laughter grew louder and louder. It was actually an indescribable joy and satisfaction. The laughter gradually stopped. His cold and gloomy face instantly relaxed. He said calmly, "Good kill.